Ya. Bueno, buenos días.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you for coming, for being here. We are going to start the second meeting line at home to 8. Before this short introduction, I hope it's brief, I would like to thank several people, their involvement. Thank to Javier Tamariz. I don't know if he is with us because 1 year ago he suggested the idea of using Ceapat like a knowledge place for ideas discussion. Thank you, Javier, for identifying the word meeting with Ceapat and with this wonderful idea. Thank you also to Héctor García Cantarón, who will be making a presentation for SBI involvement in the Copenhagen University. He helped us to organize this seminar and to contact the architects participating in the second session. Thank you for all the participants to enriching and valuable meeting. I think your collaboration has been beyond the preparation of the presentations. We have such valuable and personal valuable people have production too. They do a flawless job, and the students from the European University of Madrid helping us to transmit this Congress. What we were looking for was to discuss what's going to happen in 10, 20, 30 years with us who make part of the silver economy and the baby boom. I don't know if the silver bullet will be the concept adopted that will be double in 2030. This generation of active people, intellectually and physically, we will be a population with a high degree of training, health and culture, and demanding consumers will demand as long as our skills change, product and service, helping us to maintain our lifestyle and our activities. Today we are going to focus in home. This is a space where our lives take place. 9 out of 10 retirees stay at home. They prefer to age at home and to be independent. In order to continue, we need the home, and the products used in the home will be a support for our functional limitation, improving our quality of life. We look for the interesting designs for all the people, all ages, all our skill. And we look for products, inclusive products, instead of discriminating product, providing opportunities. I'm going to give the floor a little bit to introduce these days structured in 3 different blocks, in principle, to deal with emerging technologies, making possible to stay at home for a longer time. In fact, there are companies, universities, and different entities doing research in this field. Certain weeks ago, we formally initiated REDA, the domotic network. Very few homes, this option is a reality. That's why we are going to deal with this issue in next meetings. At that moment, we had this idea. We were in contact with the Denmark embassy, and they supported us. We hope to have their help in the future. To say this is a bilingual day. There is an audio channel transmitting in English. A student from the Master for University Accessibility in the University of Aalborg in Copenhagen. We are structured in 3 blocks. There's a questions and answers session afterwards. The people following this day through streaming. Use always the microphone. Don't ask questions without microphone, please. Some minutes before, we will have the participation of Cristina González Porrero, former director of Ceapat, and after we have a 20-minute break in which we will broadcast 2 videos for the attendance through streaming. Some minutes before the beginning of the 3rd block, we have Carlos Sánchez Martin presenting the Observatory for Universal Accessibility for year 2013 with the ONCE Foundation and the Thermo. All this day will be recorded in the YouTube channel from Ceapat, so We encourage you to participate and to share this content. We request to be really punctual for the streaming issue is important. Thank you, Carlos. We start with today's session. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for being here and for those who follow us to streaming. First, and within this first item, it's framing the meeting. We have José Antonio Corraliza, professor of environmental psychology in the University of Madrid, environment and agent contributions from environmental psychogerontology. Thank you very much to all those attending the meeting here and through internet. What I would like to do this morning is anything but to propose you a night more with academic terms. Some of you may think that environmental psychogerontology is such a big word. It's for a nightmare and insomniac, the brain professors. No, it's an attempt, even if it's an ugly word, to merge a perspective which provides life about the complex problems emerging when we try to relate person and environment. We all know, even intuitively, in our own experience, sometimes we feel good, we feel bad, we feel well, bad, we block or we stimulate ourselves. There is no internal reason explaining. These responses, action, reaction, have their origin above all in the external stimulation, exogenous stimulation, the environment. When we think about this regarding the elderly, I still like, I don't know if this is incorrect, political idea, old people, for me, is not negative term. I don't know why the Ramón y Cajal text on this topic. When this person-environment system, this interaction we analyze in the elderly, in the old people, a problem comes up. It is such a presentation. I don't know if it's interesting what we are saying. It is more interesting the questions raised. I would like to underline the dilemma appeared here on the top. For the elderly, there is a dilemma in any program for social policies, promotion or help for the elderly is the dilemma between the level of skills of the person and the degree of the environment promoting or being a hindrance to the competence level of this person. This is the more relevant problem, and I would like when we finish this presentation you would understand the relevance of this question. All it is, we try to show or to demonstrate that it's important to take into account these factors. Environmental psychogerontology as a perspective is supported by gerontology and environmental psychology. Many of you know what is psychogerontology, but maybe any of you have heard about environmental psychogerontology, but not from an academic perspective. Think about just one sentence. A sentence I will summarize in such a way. First, people, we may create an environment, and then the environment configurates or makes us, builds us. This is the idea. What we should see is until what point conditions for aging, active, passive aging, are promoted, or there is a hindrance from that is the far distant environment or the closer environment, like the house or the room. The concept of environment is relevant. I prefer setting, which is ambiente, comes from surrounding. What we see is that a person is surrounded like an onion, if you allow me by successive layers, and these layers have an influence and determine our behavior and our lifestyle and our psychological performance. In the case of the elderly, this dilemma face the personal competence level and the promotion or the non-promotion of these skills is an essential, is crucial for the elderly, until which point the dilemma regarding planning is face an old person. We have hyper-protective environments or hyper-challenging environments, if you allow me this expression with the hyper. Christina said before, the underlying topic, an old person with a level of skills to live in a nursery home or at home. Most of the people prefer to live in their homes. The issue is this. Is this positive to maintain an optimal level of competence? How can we analyze this dilemma? We can, in social policy, to be fashionable, the ideas in favor of the nursery homes, because if not, we are not supporting the elder. Or now that we promote supported houses or people staying at home. How to analyze all these are several assumptions, epistemological assumptions, that I will leave on the table during my presentation, but I don't want to insist more. We have to analyze a complex unity, which is not the person or environmental conditions, but the merger, what appears as person-environment. Is a unity. And the only thing we know, what we want to say is the interesting is to analyze the interactions. For instance, faced to the discussion, is it clear that it's better for an old man or woman to stay at home and to have the social policy, to have the programs for house modification, house enhancement? And the question, it's always like this, it's the most appropriate. Imagine a person living alone, with a level of dependency middle, difficulties to go out to the street, to move. Its own urban space is quite important, has its own restrictions derived from this fact. Have difficulties to go out to the street, to be victim of a theft, or is afraid of using public transportation because he is afraid of having an accident or to break a leg. In this case, home is the most appropriate solution. In which condition? Home. Sometimes we can think that a person under these conditions to seclude him or her at home, visited by the assistant carer with doses, very dangerous doses of TV. Maybe it's more interesting to combine this with other resources. In order to understand this, I will show you in a scheme. We analyze the environmental experience of the elderly. This complex unit, we have three big parameters. The pointer is not working. I indicated with the mouse. There are three big parameters of individual response: emotion, what you feel, what you think, a thought, and what you do, performance, action. All these will provoke three big parameters we should analyze in the case of the elderly: emotional welfare, personal satisfaction, and the optimal level of competencies. And to analyze, we know all this flow these are personal resources who play a role, the level of health, objective and self-reported, the level of competences, personality traits, and so on. And there are socio-environmental conditions that may be categorized in 3 layers, like the onion, the closer layers, microsystemic variables, the home, the bathroom, the ergonomics of domestic resources, plus the structure of the building, the accessibility level, and the macrosystemic variables, the environment or the setting of the house, the neighborhood, the parks. Our central question will be until what point what the person feels, the emotion, what the person thinks or does is determined or promoted by the environmental conditions. This way there is an important concept, which is, if you remember the assumption I put on the table, a middle dependency person living isolated at home, until what point the home is compatible with the needs, demands and intentions of this person. Compatibility is a very important concept. Until which point? You see this graph based on a compatibility level. There are 2 sources of activity, internal dimension and the external or environmental dimension, 2 kinds of mental activities. Image, the cognitive capacity and the action plan. What we need to see is to ask the question until what point the conditions. If we cross, we have internal images, the reflective activity, images with an external origin, what a person thinks induced by external stimulation in the plans. They have the intentional action and unintentional action. And there is compatibility with the intention, what someone wants to do coincides what the person has to do, and there is an incompatibility otherwise. We need to analyze the environments for all age in terms of compatibility, how they promote or they are a problem for this. Speaking about public transportation system, until which point ergonomic conditions, accessibility promote that a person with a level of competencies, middle, may access freely with a certain safety conditions. If a person doesn't perceive this is like this, he will stay at home and he or she will shorten the opportunities to open to other relationships with the environment and with other people. We will speaking about an incompatibility situation. The same about with the house. The sources of incompatibility are 3. Mainly when the environment has inadequate information or there is a lack of appropriate information. There is a restrictive capacity of the environment, for instance, elevators, all the accessibility resources will be linked to this, and there is another incompatibility with an internal origin, for instance, depressive response patterns before the appearing before dementia and other neurodegenerative pathologies coincide with people who don't want to go out to the street and so on. The situation. We could speak about 3 types of environment. This is a key question. A controllable environment. The person can feel safe in an environment, for instance, at home or in his or her room. There are also the supported environments with equipments, with facilities or tools promoting the adaptive development of certain targets. Housing modifications, supported environments, bars in the corridors, adaptation for the bathroom. A third environment, which is restoring environment. It's very easy. The controlled environment and the supported environment. It's more difficult to understand the restoring environment, but it's unavoidable too. may allow me to speak about a fact we are working on recently. In fact, the old age in certain environments is a source of added stress to the stress provoked for difficult environmental conditions and even the aging situation, and problems come up. In contact with some Swedish experiences, but they are already developing in Spain, we advocate for unusual environments, helping the people to recover from this stress experience. For instance, in situations chronic anxiety or depressive conditions, we realize the strategic role of experience like direct contact with nature. There are some gerontologists recommending to the elder to stay for 14, 15 days in nature in Extremadura, for instance, because I am from Extremadura. There are magnificent places there. The idea of looking for restoring environments, I don't know if you understand this concept, is crucial. Some gerontologists are issuing prescriptions with these recommendations. Some pilot studies, we see the relation between having a nature direct contact. It has a correlation, a negative correlation for minus 0.7. It's a direct and proportionate relation. More contact, lower level of stress. The home is a prototype of controlled environment. Adapted home is the supported environment. Another restoring environments may compensate the sources of stress. Well, manifestations of incompatibility situation, I'm going to stay here. It's awful, the PowerPoint, because you vomit slides like this. I want to just pass to have some meaning for them. These are the central ideas I wanted to provide to you. When there is an incompatibility situation, there are 4 manifestation stress responses. Environmental demand is higher than the capacity of response from the body. When this over-demand becomes a threat for the welfare of the person, there is an overcharge, stimulating overcharge. The elder and not so old will live such experiences in which our capacity is saturated, like many of you, because I have been speaking for 20 minutes. And overcharge is attention overcharge. Our attention capacity is overwhelmed, and we take out like an umbrella to protect ourselves to this storm of stimuli. The reduction of the subjective feeling of control. In this way, I would like to tell you the true challenge we are facing when we consider house adaptation programs, supported homes, and the mixed fashion of considering the whole institutional space like mixed spaces. A person has a private space and also a public space accessible. What is very important is the idea, is my last idea, the theory of environmental docility. The level of welfare of the person is a function of 2 parameters, the amount, the level of external stimulation, on the other hand, the level of personal competence. The level of external stimulation may be low, which is jargon expression by psychologists to explain boredom. Many old people, one of their main problems is stimuli monotony, and we may live it when we live alone. You're isolated, have a similar monotony situation. This is a challenge. Every minute you need to invent every minute of your life, every day of your life. The level of stimulation may be very high and may provoke anxiety states, a fear to face This is a huge stimulation for a person, and now I'm about to finish with another idea. The level of personal competence may be high or low to face this stimulation. We may come across two situations. The first one, which is this rectangle, the level of stimulation is too low, very low, and the other, who is marked with this rectangle, the level of stimulation is excessive. Both place the person in a stressful situation. We are all used to recognize these situations when there is an environmental over-demand, a person gets fearful, and when there is under stimulation is much better. What we need to look for is the intermediate point, the optimal level of welfare. The situation, there is a level of maximum performance when a person has a demand a little bit higher than his or her level of competence. If there is a real problem to define the environments for the elderly, this is a hyper-protective environment. Hyper-protection allows us to predict the person with a level of competence will be even lower. It's preferable to consider environments of this level in which we come across a demand a little bit higher than his or her level of competence to avoid environmental docility. I wanted to tell you about many other things, but during the questions and answers session, we can develop a little bit more the ideas raised. It has been too abstract, but my role initially was to offer these theoretical references, and all the ideas must be assessed. What we pretend, what are our aims, compatibility, level of competence, environmental stimulation, and environmental docility are the four key concepts to understand the relation between environment and the person.
Thank you so much, José Antonio. We will keep that in mind. And now, entitled Aging, Health and Life Quality, we have José Antonio Sierra, who is in charge of the geriatrical service at the hospital, the General University Hospital Gregorio Marañón. I will tell you when you have 5 minutes left. Thank you so much to Ceapat for thinking of us in order to talk about aging, health, and life quality. And I would like to thank Cristina Raz, my old friend, whom I've met many times over all through my professional life. Thank you, Cristina, for inviting me. I will try during this next 1 minute to give you some brushstrokes of concepts which I believe need to be always present when we're talking about older people or elderly, whatever we want to call them. These are things that we always need to take into account, because when we're advancing in the development of an idea, sometimes we are not all using the same terminology. So those are the things that I would like to talk about during the next 20 minutes. The mistake that is often made, and there was an article in the newspaper El País that made that same mistake as well, is that we think that we live more than you used to live 2,000 years ago, when we started doing demographic surveys and survival surveys. But the difference is that now we have more people reaching those high ages of life. That is the difference of the maximum life expectancy, which is the maximum that a human being can reach, which is the same that we had 2,000 years ago. The concept is the concept of average life expectancy. That is the difference. That is the statistical life expectancy of a person in an environment. If we have a community with two people and one dies when he was born after one day being born, and the other one dies when he was 100 years old, the average life expectancy of that community would be 50 years old. So ageism is a word that has been translated into Spanish that is difficult to understand, but it is about discriminating due to age. And we want to insist on this, because no matter where we're talking about the elderly or old people, it's always good to fight against this discrimination, which I'll explain later on is still very frequent in our environment nowadays. I don't want to take much time giving you examples of this story because you already know it, but this lady here, Jean Camet, is the one who has a record. She is the eldest person that could, well, she's the eldest person who could prove that she was the oldest one, because they say that Methuselah was 1,000 years old, but we don't have any evidence proving that fact. These are some evidence from the Greek era to show that there were already people who were 100 years old 2,000, 2,500 years ago. The average for life expectancy has increased due to two concepts. On the one hand, fortunately, only a few children die when they're born in the perinatal phase, so those children who die when they're 1, 2, 3 years old are exceptional cases thanks to the improvement in the sanitary and health services. And now we see that diseases that would kill in 2, 3 years' time, 50 years ago, now people can still be alive for 15, 20 years, although they might have those same diseases. I don't want to enter in detail with regards to this graph, but it's just to show you that a person who was born in 1900 would have an average age of 33 years old. That did not mean that everyone would have died when they were 34 years old. Now our life expectancy is around 80 years of age, more amongst women than men. But you need to know that when you are 50, when you're 80 years old, you can still live for 3 years or for 5 years or even 10 or 15. But these statistical data are quite interesting and useful when making decisions. Something that's very interesting is the fact that the elderly, the group of elderly has increased. We are around 18% now, and in 20 years it'll be 30%. 1 out of 3 Spanish citizens will be over 65 years old. But we have to make a difference between concepts. We need to understand that the segment of population that is going to grow the most is that of Spaniards who are 80 to 85 years old. So we will have a higher percentage of older people, and that collective will be of greater age. And it's different to work with people who are 60, 70 years old than working with people who are 90 years of age. Something that's very important, which I believe we all should insist upon, is trying not to stigmatize the elderly, old people, because we also call them old people. We call them like that. And I ask them whether they like being called old or not, and they say they like that, because sometimes in Spanish you can use the word young with a negative nuance to it. So we have lots of elderly people working with us, and there is a very important stigma. Last year, the Prime Minister in Japan said that when you're 75 years old, you had to be killed, more or less, because you were wasting too much money, much of society's money, because the elderly spend too much and they produce very little. I remember that 20 years ago, youngsters wanted to look older. They used to wear black jackets and beards so that they would look older because they would be respected. But now the elderly try to do things so that they will look younger. And I did a test. I ran a test. I wrote down aging problems in Google. They had thousands of different entries, but if I wrote success, aging, I didn't get many hits. And what's aging, or what's being old? When are we considered old? 65 years old, and that comes from Bismarck's age, when at the end of the 19th century, when the troops came back from their victorious battles, he said that those soldiers who were over 65 years old would be retired but would still be paid. At that time, coming back from battle being 65 was not very normal, so it wasn't very costly from the social point of view. But when we established in 1919 our pensions plan, only 19% of population would reach 65 years old. But right now, 90% of our population can reach that age. But that is still the point where we consider you become old. And the Academy, the Spanish Academy, says that you are old when you are over 65. But Mastroianni said that the old age is that era era when you can say what you really think, and I think that's quite true. We mustn't really act as though we weren't our age, and you need to understand that the alternative from being old is to die. So I think that that can also be a good definition. Being old isn't easy, and often we try to say what old isn't, or what isn't being old. Being old does not mean being sick. It's true that there are some diseases that are more frequent amongst the older people than the younger people, but being sick is not necessarily something that goes hand in hand with being old. And we also see that the elderly don't tolerate certain things that youngsters do tolerate, such as dehydration, pneumonia, and there are many different things that they tolerate less. But aging is a process that changes amongst people, and we have quite a lot of experience. We know that 85-year-olds can be very well or can be very sick, and it depends on the organs of that person. Some people who are 85 years old, they have a liver that is doing very well, but their heart is doing very badly. So the aging process is very variable. When we work with older people, we need to understand that this collective is a very heterogeneous community. I'm not going to explain the different sorts of old people that we have, but this is Pepín Bello, who died when he was 102 years old. He was the secretary of the Residencia de Estudiantes, and he used this stick because he was a dandy, but not because he needed it. Clint Eastwood is 80 years old. He is an old man. Or Sean Connery, he is 82. He is old as well. Francisco Ayala. There are many people who are old, but I need to just make you see that the elderly community is a very heterogeneous one. Obviously, not all people have the same diseases, but a very high percentage of old people have chronic diseases that can be healed. They have hypertension, diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, ischemic cardiopathy, arrhythmia. They have lots of different diseases that will make them have to take lots of different types of drugs. And this is a risk. I mean, there is a risk of having problems that are not necessarily considered medical problems, but they have an impact. And then we have the functional problems. This is where we enter the field of these seminars. So the elderly have a risk of having higher level of problems of dependence, mental problems, or poor social family support that will make it necessary for them to have some sort of support. And when you ask the elderly, and this is a questionnaire that was carried out 2 years ago, the elderly in general consider themselves to be very well, doing very well. Old people of 65 to 70 years old, over half consider that they're doing very well. When we ask people who have 85 or more, 30% say that they're doing well or very well. So although when you're young, you always think, oh my God, they are doing so badly. But when we ask that collective of people, they think that they're doing very well. And sometimes we miss line of thought, and we think that the criteria of life quality is the same when you're 30 as when you're 80, but that's not right. Dependence is also very, very much present. The older we are, the greater the risk to be dependent. We were talking about the fact that when you're 65 years old, you usually have 20 years still to live from a statistical point of view, but we will have a third of those years with a higher degree of dependence. And what does that depend from? So these is the total: male, female, different age phases, dependence to walk around the house or to climb stairs, to go out and walk down the street. These are the different degrees of dependence that we can analyze and that we see that more frequently take place amongst the elderly, and that force to cover certain needs that the system is not ready to cover. Something that is very important, and it's actually the most important idea that I want to transmit to you, is how do the elderly become disabled? This is something that needs to be understood because it gives us very valid information when trying to set a strategy for intervention. When we see a 30-year-old who is using a wheelchair, we usually ask them, how long have you been there? They usually tell you you a date in an hour. On August 17th at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I had an accident. This is why I'm using a wheelchair. That does not happen with the elderly. Usually the dependence is progressive in time. And sometimes you ask an elderly, how long have you been on a wheelchair? And they don't know if it was 2 or 4 years ago, because it's been progressive. It's been little by little. And that means that if we detect it in the first phases or the first stages of dependence, then we will have much more time to intervene and to revert that dependence. That dependence, which in most cases amongst the elderly comes from lack of use, atrophia, because they don't use their muscles anymore. I exercise less and less because I've been in hospital for 3 weeks with pneumonia, and I've been in bed for 3 weeks, or because I don't have a lift, or because I've had the flu and I've been at home for a couple of weeks without getting out, or because the winter was very cold and I didn't get out of my house. So that will cause muscle atrophia, which will make that person become more and more dependent until at the end they will be in a situation that can't be reverted. So I really want to insist on this fact, on this progressive course through time with regards to disability amongst the elderly. So what do we mean by health amongst the elderly? If health is the absence of disease, then I'm guessing that there are no elderly people who are healthy, because if having to wear glasses because you can't see well, then you're sick, or if having hypoacusia, then you're not healthy either. If we go to the dictionary of the Royal Academy of Spanish Language, they define health as having an organic self that exercise their function. So we are relating health with functionality without specifying exactly what we're referring to. The World Health Organization defined health as a state where there is an optimum situation of physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just an absence of sickness. With this criteria, I don't know if we would find anyone healthy amongst the elderly, someone who doesn't have sickness and who has a well-being from the social, family, and on all sorts of viewpoints. The World Assembly for Aging 30 years ago drew the following conclusion: attention to people of age needs to go beyond the purely pathological viewpoint and should consider the whole of their well-being, considering the interdependence of physical, mental, social, and environmental factors. So it's not saying that the health of the elderly they're telling us that there are 4 pillars: the medical part, sickness; the physical part, dependence or disability; the mental one, cognitive deterioration or depression; and then the social, family, environment. If we only focus on one of those pillars and we don't consider those other 3 pillars, then we will be having a table that is not as stable as it should be. And this happens very often in the medical area. We forget about all the other pillars who are as important as the medical one, that have to do with survival, with resource consumptions, with health, resource. So dependence, physical dependence, is as important as medical problems that usually people consider as the most important ones. Very well. So what are the objectives that we should have when considering the elderly? We have to prevent diseases, obviously. Can we prevent diseases for the elderly? We're all now getting flu shots, because with the shot you can prevent having the flu, because the flu kills many more people every year than Ebola, but it doesn't have as much transcendence. Can we prevent disabilities as well? Well, that's very important. When we ask the elderly, and there are data in these surveys, health surveys, what's the factor that has a greater impact on your life quality? The elderly don't usually tell us that what's most important is that their blood pressure isn't over 50 millimeters of mercury. They usually tell us that what's most important to them is to be able to do things on their own. So being independent, functional independence, is very important to them. And we are much dedicated to preventing diseases or treating diseases, but we don't don't invest so much in preventing disability. And we also have to try to avoid chronic diseases, and we can do that, and we do it, or we try to do it at least. The third objective is to minimize the impact of sickness in their functional situation, and that is something that we don't do in hospitals. We treat sickness very well, but we turn them into disabled people, and that happens as well in elderly homes. Hospitals are designed for a population that was a population of 50 years ago. That's actually a copy of hospitals in the 40s or 50s, and our hospitals are not right now adequate for the population who is using those hospitals. That is why seminars such as this one are so useful. We need to try and improve the quality of life, considering what that elderly person thinks quality of life is. And in the end, something that might be considered silly is to maintain the elderly person living life as best as he can until the end of their days. That is dying healthy. It's something that people don't understand. That sometimes people say, oh, he's died although he was feeling so well. Well, I think that's great. Or thank God he died. At least he could rest. After suffering for 15, 20 years, he finally can rest. Well, there are lots of strategies that could be put in place, and there is a new trend trying to have people die while being very healthy. I'm going to finish now. So the objective shouldn't be to increase the life expectancy, which we have obtained, but also minimize dependency amongst the elderly. If we could sign an agreement, we would all agree to live very, very well and then die all of a sudden. That's what we would like to happen with 180 years of age and not 90, obviously. And we would like to have, a disease that would end with our life very quickly. But most frequently, what we see is people who end their lives in a non-satisfactory way, and we wouldn't want that to happen to us, would we? And I will end with this concept, this important concept, which is that the fact that the way in which we age will depend on the inheritance, what gets from our parents, our DNA. It also depends on the accidents that we suffer, but it also depends, in 65 of the cases, it depends on our habits, our life, the way we carry out our life. So it is in our hands. The way we are going to age depends on what we do. It depends on the diet, physical exercise, and the environment. And that's where urban planners have a lot to do, because the environment is something that they decide about. If we need to consider what an elderly person needs, we need to know what his or her sicknesses are, their physical situation, their mental situation, and their social situation as well. And those 4 pillars are the ones that have an impact on their life. If we act on those 4 pillars, we will achieve for our elderly to live for a very long time, as we have achieved up till now, but they will also have the highest quality of life until the moment they die. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, José Antonio. Has terminado incluso.
Thank you very much, José Antonio. You actually ended before we expected you to finish. We don't have much time, but we do have a few minutes for you to ask questions. I can see that there are some raised hands, so please wait until the microphone is handed to you to ask your questions. Where?
Sí, veo que está preparado.
Hello, yes, I can see that it's ready. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to make 3 comments talking about the system that José Antonio was offering us, the person-environment system. I think it's wonderful to be able to contemplate the reality we find ourselves in right now. And I think it's a wonderful way to present it so that we can analyze it and make decisions. I wanted to talk about the use of the term elderly people. I'm guessing that many of us have already realized that this is being used, and in other moments, even José Antonio, the other speaker who intervened, also used it. When talking about the elderly, we don't use, we are not being sexist in our language, because we talk about old people in Spanish. It's a masculine word, so we always have a very clear image, and if we use the word old lady in Spanish, then we would think about a woman. So there is much sexism in the term if we say old. So I'm not saying that we should conform to the elderly people term, but I'm talking about the importance of language itself in all of its dimensions, internal, exterior, when creating our reality. And that is what José Antonio was referring to with regards to psychogerontology, environmental psychogerontology. I'm so sorry. I know I'm taking too much time. I'm really sorry. I'm going to try and speak more quickly. With regards to the dilemma that José Antonio was presenting, if we talk about hyper-protective or hyper-defiant or challenging environments, you have already talked about that. I just wanted to say that you have talked about that in other terms. We could also talk about hyper-facilitating environments with regards to giving support or providing support. And I've already talked about old ladies and old men, but it's also important to introduce the gender perspective in all the dimensions that we take into account in psychogerontology. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for taking so much of your time. Well, Fernando, thank you very much for your comments. I think that they are quite enriching. I just wanted to make two very brief commentaries. It's actually a bit of a slogan. I agree with you. Words are very important, and Lewis Carroll said that the problem is who invents the words, and the person is who has the power to invent those words. The only thing that I wanted to do here was simplifying things. I didn't want for this to become the object of discussion. I just wanted to talk about the subject at hand. But I think that what you're saying is quite interesting, the hyper-facilitating environments. The problem is that, and my colleague, my illustrious colleague, has said we can't think of standard criteria, but because it's very difficult to find two old people who have the same level of autonomy, dependency, etc. And this in a context where we are simplifying the problems of simplification, that worries me. And I would also highlight that it is very important wherever the person finds herself to have the possibility of developing basic functions, to be able to develop their own processes of appropriation, we could say, of space. I was a sociologist originally, and then I became a social psychologist and then environmental psychologist. And I always remember that our relationship with the environment is like our relationship with people. If we really love someone, we will be engaged to that person. And if we're engaged, then we have many more possibilities of doing interesting things. And the same happens with the environment. And the real problem that we have is when a person is disconnected to their environment. And that the opposite of disconnection is that feeling of belonging. The Association for Old People's Homes had in the rules they said that an older person could not have a plant pot or their own pajamas and so on. And some homes forbade them from having pictures hanging on the walls. And that, fortunately, changed 15 years ago. But until then, it was forbidden. I'm sure that there were some excesses. I'm guessing that someone put 30 different plants in their room in the home, and because they couldn't use their own towels, for instance. But it's very important for people to, wherever they are, may develop this basic function of considering that the space belongs to them, and they need to be able to customize the space. And I will leave it at that because I know that other questions will be asked. We are following through the internet the questions that have been sent, and I would like to ask 3 questions to the panel. There is one comment that says that many older people would rather grow old here in Spain, and the question is it due to environmental conditions or is it due to the housing conditions? The housing conditions or the environment conditions. There is another one that says that the population is very heterogeneous. If every person should decide where they want to live. And another question that we considered was very interesting said that people, older people, demand improvements in the environment, or do. Actually, the question is, do elderly people ask for improvements in the environment, or do they conform to what happens, to what exists, or they're all right with what happens? I don't understand that question of whether people should decide where they want to live. Of course, who is going to decide that for them? State? The state? Well, people should decide where they want or can live. I can't think of any other solution. I can't think of any other possibility. And then I think that they refer to the family environment, because very often the elderly people can't decide. Oh, that is important. That is something that needs to be considered. And we at our office sometimes face that challenge. We have to confront the families, because sometimes they tend to think that the elderly are children, and sometimes they come to the office and they say, I want you to forbid my father from driving. I'm not the one issuing licenses. I'm not the one issuing driving licenses. Or they say, forbid him to live, or forbid him to marry the caretaker. I'm saying things that I'm not making up. I'm sure that you all have heard that being said often. The elderly person needs to have the capacity of deciding. Of course, they have to be the ones to decide. They're not children. And this increase of older people is quite recent. That is why society needs to adapt to this situation. But who's going to decide for them? That person, obviously. If you'll allow me, I completely agree with José Antonio Serra with regards to the importance of this question. But my question would be the following. Can't that person really decide? Because very often they can't decide. I'm going to give you two cases that have to do with housing conditions. This lady who was a widow, and she was in a very good financial situation. I'm sorry to give this Madrid example, but she had purchased the flat next door, and many people did that at a certain point. She had united those two flats, and she had 4 children, and she had an apartment that was over 200 square meters in a good neighborhood in Madrid. But suddenly her husband died. He died of a sudden disease, and her children left, and then she had a flat that was over 200 square meters, and with her pension she couldn't even pay for heating. She couldn't pay for the heating in the apartment. So what do I mean with that? Not only the people grow old, houses as well grow old. They change. So we need to clearly think about the situation. Could that person really decide at that time? She could decide what she decided to do, and this could have a lot to do with this intergeneration situation. Well, one of her daughters was working at the university, so she ended up being the host, or she ended up having university students living in her house. But it was very difficult for her to decide about this. And then there was another case when the house is really isolating us. We are in a very comfortable setting, but we are isolated. And in the central neighborhoods in Madrid, I'm sorry to refer to Madrid because it's the city that I know best, but these are neighborhoods that are aging as well. And for a very long time, the youngsters have left the center of the city, and they have gone to peripheral neighborhoods in the city. You know that usually cities grow as an oil stain, and youngsters have gone to the periphery, to Leganés, to the south, to the western neighborhoods at the outskirts of the city, and these older people are now isolated. But they want to be where their children are. They want to help them, taking their grandkids to school and so on, but it's not possible for them to do it because it's very difficult to go from Lavapiés to Majadahonda or from Lavapiés to Leganés for an older person. What I want to say with this is that sometimes it's not for them to decide. There are experiences, for instance, when we have a person who culturally has been given the possibility of moving to another flat. You can rent your flat, and then you can move to a flat that's closer to where your children live. And next Friday, on the 31st, we will be presenting the Habitat report here in Madrid. That is the report that has been developed by Spain for the UN conference, Habitat 3, that will take place very, very soon for 2015. And I have had the chance of coordinating the drafting of this report, and we included a reflection. It is a very synthetic report that has to follow the template that has been sent by the UN. But I consider that the environmental dilemma is very interesting with regards to the elderly. For instance, people who live in aging neighborhoods, their houses are also growing older, and the best thing is to take them outside of the city, and then the youngsters come back to the center of the city. I don't know if you get this. My idea is, couldn't we think of an experience that facilitates intergeneration cohabitation? And I will finish with one anecdote. A few years ago at a university, I was at a debate on public spaces and elderly people. I have to say that it's one of the few places where I was scandalized from the intellectual point of view. My spine moved even. An urban planner proposed designing a park only for the elderly, only for the old people. And I thought, but is this possible? Is it possible for someone to really imagine what makes a park attractive for the elderly? Go see other elderly people? I don't know if they started building this park. I think it didn't pan out. But it's also about something completely different is including equipment that is good for the elderly. But it's always good to be able to see kids, to see people who are younger, seeing people riding a bicycle, although there is the risk of being run over. But that is going to be the attractive thing for someone who is older. Thank you very much.
I guess this has to do with the level of competences. With this presentation, to thank both of you. It's been very interesting. The discussion is too short, but to respect the schedule and not to take time from the other speakers. And I introduce Cristina Gomez Porrero, Director of Ceapat. During the change of tables, she's going to have the floor. Face to the camera. Good morning, Cristina. From here, we wanted to ask you, due to your experience in administration, how do you think administration is dealing with the housing topic and the increase of the aging population? Thank you very much for asking me this question. I'm going to try to answer in a very summarized way. I have 3 points. I prepare 3 points. The first to this response on how the administration is facing the housing and the increase of the aging population. What I consider is the administration recognizes its challenge of aging and housing, recognizes the influence of environment to be able to have an active aging and to receive the care and the support needed. It's very important, this recognition, because without this recognition there will be no actions, no policies. The White Book on Active Aging, Chapter 12, is devoted to housing. The network of friendly cities for the elder, there are two websites, and one of the websites is the housing. This same Congress is show the interest of the administration in these issues. And first, administration recognizes There is a challenge regarding aging person and environment. The administration knows, and I would like to thank, we are working closely with the associations representing the elderly. They know the preferences of the elder, research, publications, surveys, and statistical reports reflect that while they can, the elder prefer to live in a usual environment, and when they are in a nursery home, they prefer that this nursery home be as similar as their usual environment. Administration recognizes and knows the preferences of the elderly. Another thing, we enact legislation on housing and the elder. We have the Article 47 from the Constitution. All Spanish have a right to adequate and appropriate house, and the public power will promote this right. For instance, the Autonomy and Care for Dependent Person Act in year 2000, in the third additional regulation, established help subsidies to promote accessibility and mobility at home, contributing to improve the interaction between the person and the home through home services, adapting the houses and accessibility. More recently, the reformulated text rights of people with disabilities according to the Convention of Persons with Disabilities establishes in different articles different criteria for host and disabled housing, and the elderly. Chapter 16 deals with technical building criteria. Article 32, reservation of houses, remodelation of houses, and also badges to adapt buildings, public ways, parks, and gardens. If we set aside the aspect of the field of rights, but linked to the rights, technical legislation, we have technical code for building, basic documents, sewer, safety, use, utilization, and accessibility consider many issues regarding housing and accessible building. And more recently, Act 8, 2013, rehabilitation and renewal of urban, the famous three R's. This act demands, apart from an energetic certification, an assessment report regarding accessibility. This act is supplemented with the development plan of the three R's: rehabilitation, regeneration, and renewal. Administration, in summary, recognizes the challenge of interaction between environment and aging person, knows the preference of the elderly, enacts legislation in order that the houses may comply with these requirements, and thirdly, carries out the action derived from these rights and the importance of these homes for the aging. This third aspect is maybe where we fail. We should improve. To summarize this field specific actions by the administration, I would speak about the 3F: financing. In all the autonomous communities, there are financing systems and facilities to adapt the houses, in certain cases with better or worse results, with more or less sustainable. We could speak about this for a long time. The other hand, other F, which will be at its training technicians, controlling and designing these environments will be better trained. And we could speak a lot because we have not achieved the goals. Easiness or friendliness for tax deduction in reverse mortgages, all these supports or subsidies we know or we don't know, so the person may live live in a family environment as long as he or she wishes, promoting their active life. And this is the summary. From the administration, we recognize, we know the problem, we legislate, and we carry out the right actions. What can I think? What's missing? What is missing is a global action on housing and aging population, establishing priorities, identifying best practices, and being a reference. Why? Because there are many things, but not very well coordinated. That is, lacks a global strategy, which is very necessary, and it's also to add a contribution from different fields: social, health, urban planning, building, technologies, computing, because housing and its environment is our small, big world. And when we grow older, this characteristic increases. There is a sentence by an expert in housing that the house is like the hardware, and care and assistance related to this home is like the software. Hardware, the own house, and all the support, adaptation, assistance are unavoidable for the person. I think though we saw administration recognizes this unity between aging and environment, knows the preference of the elder, legislates and acts providing assistance, all is not quite rather well integrated. This requires a unifying process, gathering different fields, disabled people aging, and people aging and who acquire disabilities. These fields are not well combined. There are a lot of challenges, many professionals working, and maybe a common and more general strategy on housing and environment and the elder. And I try to summarize what I thought. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Cristina. Yo creo que ha sido un repaso muy exhaustivo y vamos a continuar con la jornada.
En este bloque vamos a hacer el bloque en inglés porque técnicamente es conveniente y porque además es una jornada bilingüe y alguno de los participantes va a hacer su exposición en inglés. So I'll start speaking in English, and I'm going to introduce, first of all, Dean Simpson is with us. He's the teacher of the School of Architecture in Copenhagen. He has worked in many different countries, and he has done his doctorate in Zurich in the ETH about environment and third age. Dean, whenever you want.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a great situation to be here to present this work. For me, what I'm going to talk about today is not a best practices scenario for urban and architectural environments, but rather I'm going to present what we could imagine as a kind of experimental field of urbanism that I believe will raise and provoke many issues and discussions in the context of what we're talking about today in the panels. The work that I'm going to present is part of a larger project that is called Young Old, and in the 15 minutes I have, it's very difficult to go into all of this material, but it's just to say that this is a way to access more information. It's a book that will be out in 2 weeks' time. The research that I work on, of course, is very related to this session today, which is, of course, the relationship between a socio-demographic transformation and how we understand that producing spatial and territorial transformations. In particular, I'm focusing, of course, on aging, and aging in a differentiated sense, in the sense that I'm very interested in how, for example, the work of Peter Laslett or Bernice Neugarten theorizes a kind of bifurcation in our understanding of our old age, a bifurcation that separates a kind of young old and an old old, the notion of a young old that is independent or free of the responsibilities of childhood and adulthood, yet at the same time free of the physical and mental frailties of the later old age. What I find interesting about this is the question of how this translates into a kind of environmental discussion. My interest is the idea that, of course, we normally talk about this question of aging in relation to a number of crises. The crisis, of course, a fiscal crisis based on a crisis of dependency, the notion of many more older people being supported by ever fewer younger people in terms of a kind of state economy debate or discourse. The second, of course, is a discussion in urban circles of a shift based on a crisis of program, the idea of our cities and houses designed for younger populations increasingly being occupied by old. My own interest is, of course, in those crises, but rather in a third crisis that I would call a crisis of precedent. If we follow Laslet and Neugarten's theory of 1950 or the middle of the 20th century being the starting point that this young-old age group emerges, of course, this is a group without long-standing precedents in terms of how we discuss individuality or human subjectivity, in terms of how we understand human social collectivity, but also in terms of my own interest, a lack of precedents for how we should live and where we should live and in what context and what ambitions we have for this idea of living in a context of the young, old, or third age. And of course, in discussing this notion of a subject in experimentation, we can understand this notion of a young, old subject in a constant state of body refinement and adaptation. We can understand the idea of experiments in forms of social collectivity beyond the nuclear family, beyond the notion of the workplace as a model of social collectivity. And of course, from my own interest, the notion that what I see is many experiments that try to advance or expand upon many of the known formats of living for the old that we can understand from the left-hand column here, the notion of the multi-generational household, the idea of institutionalized care, or of course, the increasing orthodoxy, a kind of focus on the notion of aging in place. What I'm going to show and talk about briefly is some forms of urbanism and architectural formats that, let's say, expand on this logic. In many problematic ways, and we can, of course, talk about that. There are 4 case studies that I look at, 4 contemporary case studies that I'll go into. One that many of you are familiar with, of course, is the Costa del Sol, that is known internationally as the retirement home of Europe. I'm interested very much in how this becomes a destination of international retirement migration, focusing, of course, around the notion of very large-scale urban developments that take place in a very short period of time, that, of course, produce, let's say, a kind of linear, what we could call a kind of post-metropolitan condition in which, of course, the large part of this kind of linear condition is constructed from urbanizations, or excuse my Spanish, but of course these kinds of communities or developments that fill the gaps in a linear format between the kind of historical city fabric and, of course, behind the front line of hotel or resort functions. And of course, many of them take different forms, such as this, that combine, let's say, central functions within these urbanizations, but also, of course, residential areas that, of course, support large numbers of foreign retirees. The red dots you see in this image, if it's readable, represent 20 European Union citizens that are not Spanish. So you can see some sense these are the registered citizens, and of course we know that the non-registered are much larger in number. My interest is how, let's say, this kind of experimentation in terms of large numbers of older people moving to different cultural formats, how this produces entirely new cultural hybrids, how this produces different forms, let's say, of architecture and urbanism. Of course, one notion that we see is a kind of exaggeration of a kind of schizophrenic architecture between the notion of making the exotic but making it at the same time familiar. The idea of, for example, the Irish bar interior and the Pueblo Mediterraneo exterior. The second case study I'll talk about briefly is Haus ten Bosch in Japan, which is based on the standard protocols of the Japanese cultural theme park, which of course is the notion of a transported or teleported urbanism, in this case from the Netherlands to a place in Japan where we see architectural and urban objects that are, let's say, placed into another environment. From my perspective, this is interesting because it operates in many ways as a retirement community. The community you see here in the foreground is attached to this complex and occupied largely by Japanese retirees living in a Dutch-styled canal environment. What I think is particularly interesting about this environment is how the residents use the park on a daily basis as a site of daily use in terms of shopping, in terms of various club activities that take place, hobby clubs, but also that they use the park as a public space that they occupy daily. From my perspective, this operates at the intersection of two mutations. One, of course, is the application of, in the Japanese context, a super-age society transforming the logic of the theme park from lesser focus on roller coasters towards cultural experiences, and at the same time the introduction of the logics of the entertainment and industrial complex to the retirement community as an urban typology. So here we see this notion of understanding the space of the retirement community as an environment for the disposal of leisure time. At the same time, the idea of the cultural park for older users. What occurs here is quite interesting things in interviews with residents where they describe in many ways a kind of altered subjectivity and elastic subjectivity between these different forms of nationality and identity. The third case I'll talk about very briefly is the RV or recreational vehicle community in the United States, which numbers between 2 and 3 million. It's been estimated by ethnographers, which is based on, in many cases, the idea of older people selling their permanent homes and living year-round in these vehicles. What takes place is a very interesting condition of what we could call compensatory domesticity. In the idea of giving up their home, these vehicles and their interiors become even more exaggerated in their homeliness. We see this environment supported by particular infrastructures, infrastructures in this case that are both physical and non-physical. A non-physical infrastructure, that's the use of satellite internet technology, which of course emerged in the last 1 to 2 decades, which in many cases is used as a social staging area for this community with many online clubs. The Good Sam Club, for example, has over 1 million members, and also many other kind of cultures and persuasions represented in this kind of online set of communities where they can operate and let's say arrange to meet up, where there's a kind of communication between members of these different clubs that you see here. Of course, the physical infrastructure we're more familiar with, which ranges from these kinds of club or let's say resort environments that are the kind of formalized communities, in this case in Palm Springs, to much more informal use of landscape, in this case through the RV community occupying the desert in Arizona, where we see these kinds of urban formations in a place called Quartzsite, where all of these dots that you see at the bottom, sorry, it's very hard for you to see them, but there are many small dots here that represent RVs in the desert that occupy this kind of space of interaction and community. The last example in the case of the RVs is how they actually are squatting large public or semi-public space, in this case Walmart parking lots that are used by RVers on overnight stay, that are occupied as a place to stay. So these kind of infrastructures, when one maps the physical and the non-physical, produce a kind of social coherence that is as dense as this community is sparse or distributed. The fourth and last case study that I'll briefly introduce is called the Villages of Florida, which is the world's largest retirement community. It's located north of Orlando in central Florida. It has approximately 100,000 residents. Just to give you a sense of the scale here, the Villages is on the left, Sun City is to the right of it, followed by Manhattan, and on the right-hand side is the municipality of Copenhagen, which gives you maybe some sense of the scale of the villages. It's constructed out of, the name of course is referring to it being a conglomeration of many villages that operate as gated communities that are connected to a leisure landscape of golf courses and larger downtowns. These are the kind of typical areas that you see, and of course you see here also the gatehouse that we see at the top here. These are images of the downtowns that are in a way designed as the hubs. There are 3 of these downtowns that operate in the villages that function as the kind of major public centers in these environments. So just to give you some sense, these are the 4 case studies. What I argue in this research project is that represents another paradigm, let's say a supplementary or additional paradigm that faces up to, let's say, a kind of differentiated notion of aging, which suggests a shift in various ways. Of course, a shift in ethos from the ethos of care and assistance to one of leisure and entertainment. Of course, importantly, I would argue a shift in scale to understanding the question of age in relation to environment from an architectural scale problem, as we see on the left-hand side, to an urban scale problem, as we see in these examples. What I would argue about this is I would say it represents a kind of split way that we could understand or start to discuss these projects. I would argue that on the one hand it represents a form of escapism, and on the other hand we could talk about a kind of emancipatory project that these represent. If we talk about, let's say, escapism, of course we can say very much that we see these kind of scenarios as the intersection of the kind of emerging and advancing formats of neoliberal urbanism and urban development, intersecting with what we see as a kind of emergent demographic conditions, which represent in many ways a dystopia of segregation, a dystopia of many forms, including, of course, a dystopia of ignoring and let's say, overlooking or ignoring the kind of future in the fourth and final age of life. And of course we see that also in terms of a kind of dystopia of segregation, where we see here the lifestyle segmentation that is actually built in actual form. What you see here, it's a little bit maybe difficult or complex to explain, but on the image here is a view of the villages of Sun City, and we see here two segments representing 90% of the population. These two segments would be two elderly segments out of the kind of societal 66 segments that market segmentation companies understand society in terms of. So here we see 1/33 of society producing 90% of large-scale urban formats, which relates in many cases to a kind of dystopia, in this case at the villages of the village's developer not only owning much of the development, but also owning the media and also owning, let's say, the debate around local politics through their ownership of these various forms of media. I would say, on the other hand, if we talk about qualities that I would argue it's important to, let's say, consider in these environments and these experiments would be a project of emancipation. The notion that these environments represent, in many cases, a quest for utopia, a utopian quest that has many formats. For example, in this case, referring to Juan Pablo Casado, the Spanish architects, a notion of a climatic utopia of a geometry of paradise, to the notion, in the case of the American environments, of a utopia of a vacation that never ends, the utopia of youth that is predicated on the elimination of youth in the villages, the utopia of golf on Costa del Sol, that we see here also, of course, in terms of producing new coastlines of potential economic gain in the interior of Costa del Sol, to a utopia of European refinement in the context of the Japanese case studies, the utopia of the suburban single-family home in all of the case studies, and of course the utopia of freedom on the road and the notion of the utopia of nature in which the RVer immerses themselves. And of course these utopias have many resonance to earlier, let's say, hot periods of utopian exploration in architectural and urban discourse. In this case, of course, the idea of the experimentation period of Archigram, who were very interested in questioning the kind of hierarchical nature of the city as a sedentary object, into looking at different potentials in the notion of mobility and other formats of freedom associated with this kind of mobility. What I think is, just to kind of wrap up, what I think is interesting, let's say, about this is where these utopias also break down. In the context of the villages, the utopia of a vacation that never ends, based on the size of this development and its isolation spatially, it produces actually a context in which second careers take place. In this case, a retired police detective and a retired school teacher who start a second career, in this case as electronic organ shop owners and teachers. Which I think opens up another set of possibilities. I think, lastly, to talk about the idea of this experimentation, producing different kinds of, let's say, architectural and urban mutations that have other kinds of potential that we could talk about. In the context of the villages, it's a very advanced infrastructure for golf cart mobility that includes various grammars of mobility, from tunnels to bridges to roundabouts. It produces architectural mutations, in this case the golf cart garage. It produces also its own kind of culture of golf cart customization, a golf cart parade world record, that we can understand in some ways as a form of mobility that bridges, let's say, the mobility potential on the one hand of the automobile and on the other hand the electric wheelchair and the mobility scooter. The last thing that I'll just mention is, of course, the idea of health and how health in the villages is translated into the medical strip, what I call a hospital strip, in which the typical American strip mall, in this case, is reprogrammed as a form of strip hospital, which addresses various clinics and procedures that we see here, that one basically is shifted from the notion of a hospital as a single iconic megastructure into the notion of self-care along the strip as a form of shopping and consumerism. So what these, just to finish up the last two slides, is to talk about, from my perspective, a kind of entwinement of the social and the spatial in these examples. An entwinement that, in this case, produces different outcomes. In the case of the villages, a new kind of social condition in which this environment produces an entirely new set of problems. In this case, what is referred to in the media as a rampant expansion of sexually transmitted diseases, which is blamed on the one hand on a lack of sex education for this age group, and secondly on the notion of the expansion and use of Viagra. From my perspective, what I think is interesting is not only this kind of discussion of Viagra and sex education, but also the role of urbanism in this environment. The idea of the downtown as a site for social interaction, the idea of the single-family house that is attached with golf cart infrastructure, in which many of the golf cart drivers are drinking and driving, together with other kinds of products such as Big Ox, which is an oxygen product that you get over the counter that gives you very fast hangover cures. Which is kind of described in this image. So just to finish up, that I think that, let's say that from my perspective, we can talk about many problematic aspects of these experiments, but I think what's interesting is to understand them in the context of what they react against in their quest, let's say, from emancipation for the notion of institutionalization from which many of these experiments, as problematic as they are, emerge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you. I would like to excuse the presence here of Camila. Camila Riel was the first person that was going to participate in this blog about universal design and housing. Because of personal problems, she couldn't be here with us today, so we are just having the three architects, the fantastic three architects, and as well we will have some connection with Palle Steven from Finland at the end of their presentations. So now I'm going to introduce Eitor. Eitor is a researcher of the Department of Projects of the School of Architecture at the University of Universidad Politécnica de Madrid. He's doing his thesis, and he's working as well. He's working as a researcher in the SBI, which is linked with the University of Aalborg in Copenhagen. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first I would like to thank you, Christina and the Ceapat. It's so nice to be invited to come back to your country and talk about what you are researching about. That's always a big, big support, which means that we are researching about something that seems to be interesting. So thank you again. I'm going to talk about housing because I think it's one of the most, or one of the biggest discussions right now or one of the biggest demands on elderly people right now. I think it's a really complex challenge, and this is not like a bad thing. Actually, it's like a good thing. I think it's a great opportunity because I think this challenge is so complex, but it's complex on the variety, under the variety point of view, which means that we have a lot of demand, and it's so complex, so variety. So we have to provide, or the solutions has to be as, it has to be as varied as the questions that we have. So this complexity of the challenge is related to three main points which are so related to housing right now. The first one is the country and the context. I think this is normal in any kind of housing. We have to design houses that are so related to the place that they are going to be built, because the context is important in a social and in a urbanistic way. And it's so related as well to the elderly. Consider them as a social group. I think the professors before have already talked about how complex can be the social group, actually. And the last part, it would be related, the complexity related to the aging process, which is something that we already talked about. Related to this aging process, there's this concept that some architects are using to explain the relation between the aging process and the space that we need to design. And it's the concept of resilience, which is described as the capacity to recover from difficulties on thoroughness. If we have a short resilience, means that we need more external help. So this resilience, which is relating, is the dependency to the external help. You can see here how the dependency, as we saw with the professors before, is so related to the aging, to the age. So as we get older and we are more dependent, we need more external help. That's the concept which relates resilience with the space. And the different models of housing are so related to resilience, in the sense that, for example, we need a range of services and care to be provided to us. We can do it in the sense that if we are completely independent people, we just realize these activities by ourselves. And this means when we don't have any kind of problem or dependency. For example, when we are okay, but we need to go to the doctor, we go to the doctor. If we want to spend time with our friends, we go to, for example, the day center to realize some activities or whatever. And when we are completely dependent, we go to these permanent care places where we have all the care there. But the question is, what's in between? What's in between when we are okay or when we are completely dependent? That's the question that I'm trying to answer right now. So there are like two big options. The first one is a combination of activities and services, which means that our home can be in a place that we can have some services, but as well we can have our independency to think about what do we want, what do we need, related to how do we feel. And the last option is that we live in our home, and is the services the one that are offered to us? Is the service the one that comes to our place? So the ideal model, it will be the one that starts in the beginning, because we are okay, and lasts in the last stage of our life, which is when we are completely dependent. And it would be nice that our home, it will reach all the levels, from the beginning till the end. So the question right now is that there's no model. There are no models that can allow this kind of development of the aging process related to the housing. What we have is some examples that I call specialized housing. And I call it specialized because I have to distinguish it from the mainstream housing. This is not a normal housing. This is housing specialized in something related to the elderly people. And these kind of models can help us in these three levels of help and services demanded. But finally, at some point, we need a permanent care, and this one has to be done in the institutional models. Okay, the big difference between Spain and the Nordic countries, for example, is that these models in the Nordic countries allow you to stay till almost the last time or period of your life, and this one is for the average stay is 1 or 2 years. Just it's like the last stage of your life, and these ones allow you to stay in your place because the help and the care is provided by the administration or the state directly in your home. That's the policy and the regulation of the Nordic countries. So, talking about specialized in housing, I have separated in 3 different models. The first one is the shelter housing. then housing for the elderly, and then lifetime homes. This is kind of a chronological definition, because around the 50s and 60s, the model that started was the shelter housing. We will see an example, and I will explain it more. Then is the housing for the elderly, and the last one, the one that is everybody talking about it right now, is the lifetime homes. So shelter housing specializes in the attention to seniors. It's associated to any kind of dependency. It's not necessarily a completely dependent life, but it started with a semi-dependent life. And they have common facilities, permanent services, and continuous individual assistance. I think this is really important because it focuses on which are the necessities of the elderly people, but when they are already old and they already need help. This is a big difference between this example and the next ones. In this moment, these examples mean that we already need help. So this is one example from the 70s. This is in Copenhagen. You can see in gray the buildings, the apartments. This dark gray, this big spot is a day center and a nursing home. And the thing is, you will see some pictures right now, but these are supposed to be apartments for elderly people. Some of the apartments were for nurses. They were living there with the elderly people, so they were taking care of them in a sense of how much help do they need. And of course, these elderly people could go to the day center to spend the day, or if they get really, really dependent, they were just moving to the nursing home, which is close to where they used to live. This is how it looks like. This is from I said before, from the 70s, and it's this mix of one-level houses, and there are some of them with 2 levels, but all the apartments are in 1 level. These are the common gardens, but one important thing is that many of them has their own garden. This is important in the sense of identity. It's so important that people, even if you need some kind of help, you are not sick and you are not someone that cannot do anything by yourself. So identity and take care of your garden and plant your flowers and take care of them is a really important thing. Here you can see a bit more of the gardens. And I brought this example because I think it's so interesting how it started and how it has developed till now. Because when it started, it was these nurses, and they were taking care of them, so they were living there. Around the 80s, close to the 90s, they realized that it was so expensive to have nursing people there living with them. So, and because the regulation changed in Denmark, and that regulation said that the government has to provide you the health care at your own home, it meant that they didn't need the nurses anymore. So finally, there were elderly people living in these apartments with the help provided by the state, but then the regulation changed again and said that the size of the apartments were too small for elderly people. So this association, what has done is that they realized that they can take, if these are the apartments, the old ones, if they mix and put together one, and 2 of them, they can make a bigger one, which is really good. But it's so good for the elderly because it's even bigger than the regulation says for the elderly. So they have realized that this is a really good place for families. So what is happening right now is that the families are the ones which are moving to the place where the old people used to live. And I think it's so interesting because that means that I'm so tired of listening and seeing all the examples for the elderly that they are supposed to be really bad and so ugly, so nobody wants to live there. Well, but in this example, even the families want to live there, and I think it's a really interesting thing. The next example is about housing for the elderly. This is when you are not dependent or semi-dependent anyway. You are just old people, like pensionists, so you want to live in a different apartment than yours because the kids have run away or whatever. So they are specializing in to be adapted to your necessities. It's associated with the independent life, and of course they have common facilities and an external individual assistance. I mean, I have to say again that these are examples from Denmark, and the context in Denmark is different from the Spanish one. I insist, it's the government, the one that has to provide you at your home the assistance, and it has to be individualized. It has to be an assistant related to your own necessities. It's not a common assistance. So the example that I brought is all as one. It's 2 big blocks of apartments with a common space, which is the dark gray one, and a big garden in the middle. This is how it looks. It's just apartment for elderly people, and in the common spaces they have this big corridor which connects with the restaurant. They have their own restaurant. They have a common room. They have these patios where they can open the restaurant and spend the night there. They have the reception and so on. So these kind of models are still like a bit heritage of this kind of hotel-like developments, which means that you have the service there, but you are not still the one which is managing all the services. These people is living there, but it's an association or a company, the one which is in charge of the restaurant and the rest of the things. I say this because you will see that the last example is so based on that the people is ruling and managing their own developments. This is how it looks, and I think it's so important to focus how, because of these are your own apartment, you can do whatever you want in your apartment, so you can put your plans, you can change whatever you want in your apartment. That's so important. This is how it looks like. It's a big corridor with all the apartments, but these kind of models are so nice because they allow to have really different kind of apartments, which means that it can suit different kind of people, which is actually the main thing. It's like, as I said before, it's a complex challenge, and it's a complex as a social group, which means that we are not all equal. We don't want the same. So that's why the apartment has to fit our necessities. The last example is something that is starting to happen here in Spain, and it's quite common in the Nordic countries for almost 30 years, which is these kind of models are based on a participative aging, which means that it's the people, the one which is defining what do they want and how do they want it. And it means that they started when they are not even old. I mean, they are starting to get retired, or they are starting to think about that at some point they are going to need to live in a different place where they are living right now. So they try to anticipate to these aging challenges. The example that I brought is quite new. Maybe some people will know it. It's one example of co-housing, which has become a bit common, but it's a really nice place to visit. It's these rows of small houses with this dark gray is the common house. They have their own garden, but then they have all this free space which is shared for everyone. This is the way it looks like. And this means that these people was the one who decide what do they want it, and they were participating in the process from the design till the management. They are the ones that decide what do they want, how do they want it, and they are the ones which cut the grass, cut the trees, and do all the work. So it's not a company managing this kind of developments. This black big house is the one which is the common house that looks like this. So most of this participative process in the design of these models means that they need spaces to do something together. So most of these people are doing many activities like dinner together, they have their own library, they put cinema, and the best thing of this model, and that's why I brought it, is because it's placed in a place so close to the city, which means that the elderly people from the village are coming here to play cards with them, to see the movies, etc. Which means that these people has finally contribute to create a common and social network with the people of the village, and that's so important as well. This is how do they look like. This is the entrance. This is the backyard. All of them have a garden. And this is interesting as well because the architects work with a concept that was that in the beginning they designed like a basic unit for living, which is living room, kitchen, a room and a bathroom, but then to make sure that they could fit it to the different necessities of the different people which was living to live there. They designed this like this system that you can put different spaces and attach them to the basic unit, and these things can be like another room, like 2 rooms, like another bathroom, whatever you want. So this makes like a big mix of different solutions which look like this. This is the one which didn't add any kind of new thing. These ones decide to add like this glass garden. This one decide just to add 1 room, or these ones decide to add 2 rooms and a bathroom. So there's a big mix of things, which of course means that in the interior space has a relation. So this one, for example, is the one which is the basic one. So you can see at the end, this is the room, this is the living room, and on the other side is the kitchen. This is the basic unit. But for example, this one has decided that they wanted more space, so the last room is not the bedroom, it's just another room, like for the people to do still their business and so on. This is another example of how do they work. So, which are the characteristics of this housing for aging? I mean, I think that we already have talked about it a bit, but I think one of the biggest one is to promote the independence. This is something that is related to, this is an alternative solution to a nursing home. So we have really to promote the independence of the people, and the private living, the home, has to be one of the biggest or the most important parts of the designing process. Related to this is the identity. We create our own identity in our home, and if we move to another place and we cannot bring all our things, means that we are losing part of our identity. And in the same context, it's so important that you can transform some way the space that you are going to live in and make it yours. And for example, if in the entrance of your home you can put some of your pictures or your plants or whatever you want, it really helps to identify your own home. And this is helping so much in people which has this kind of cognitive illness, especially with dementia or Alzheimer, because it really helped them to identify their own home. And of course, because we know that the aging process is really complex and it's a big variation, we have to design for the change. We have to think that the necessities of the user are going to be changing all over the time. So the design has to adapt to the changes of the person. It's not the person that has to adapt to the changes or to the designing of the space. It's the space the one that has to change and adapt to the necessities of the person. Another thing that we talk about is the empowerment of the elderly people. I mean, this is something that I think is no discussion about this. It's, now you have to decide what do you want and how do you want it. And of course we have to listen to you, and the best thing to do this is through the common facilities. It's like now you have to think about what do you want and how are you going to manage and rule this kind of common facilities. And of course, based on a participative process. You can talk, but as well you have to talk. It's like we want to know what do you want, and you have to share all the activities, or at least you have to have the possibility of join the activities and share your activities if you want to. That's the big question. And the last one, it will be the integration in the social context. I think we have talked about it, and one of the questions was related to this subject. I think that we cannot create this kind of elderly ghettos. It's a big, I think it would be really bad if we do that in a conscious way. I mean that if you want to live like that, I mean, Dean has shown us some kind of examples of this. If you want to live like that, it's okay. But from the designing point of view, I think we have to keep people integrated in society in a way that they still have so much to do and so much to contribute with. And I will go so fast, I don't know if I have time, but it's just because many people ask me, what happens then when, you know, then, oh, you are completely dependent. What happened to you in the northern countries? Well, the big thing is that in the northern countries, because the state is the one which provides you a specific care at your home, they go till the end, which means that if finally they cannot provide you with the care, they move you to an institutional model. I will show you how do they look like, because they are far away from how they look like here in Spain. But the idea is that you stay in your home till the end, and if they have to move you, you are the one who has to decide if you want to go or not. You have the last word. They are not going to move you if you don't want to. That's the big thing. And if they move you to this kind of models, which are, they have renewed to a new, like, home-like environment. This is important because they don't look like the nursing home anymore. They look like homes. In fact, you will have your own apartment with a small kitchen and a small bathroom, but still it will look like your apartment. And you can take all your furniture with you. That's really important. I mean, you are just moving to another place. Even if you are in a really bad situation, you will have your stuff with you, because you're not moving to the hospital. You are moving to these kind of models that look like and are your apartment. So this means that the average stays there in the Nordic countries in these places is around 1 or 2 years. So it's for people which is like in the last period of their life. How do they look like? Well, they can look like this. I mean, we talked about it before. It's like they don't have to look like a nursing home. They don't have to look like a hospital. They can still look like homes because they are homes. This example is in Sweden, and as you can see, it's around 3 patios. And what they created, this is the group, what we call the group homes, and it's like a cluster apartments around one free space, a common space, which normally has a kitchen, so they can share activities like preparing dinner, preparing lunch, or whatever. These spaces are so related to the garden and to the apartments. The gray color are the apartments. So it's like from this common space, you have a great relation with the exterior and the garden, and at the same time, all the apartments are related to that space. This is the model that is so used for people with dementia and things like that, because it helps really much to control them. Not control them, but it helps really much to the people that is working with them. And it helps the people with dementia because they have like a reference all the time from where they are, and they can identify the place, the kitchen, and the garden. So I think that's all. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Aitor. In my introduction about you, I didn't say that you're doing your research at the university with a grant of the Danish Embassy, and I just want to repeat that many thanks for all the help you have provided us in the organization of this seminar. Okay, we're going now to introduce Agatangelo Soler. He's a researcher of the Department of Projects as well, of the School of Architecture at the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid. And his thesis is about flexible housing. Agatangelo is going to speak in Spanish, which I think will be very welcome here in the room. Okay, thank you, Agatangelo.
Thank you very much, Cristina, and thank you very much to the Ceapat.
Thank you very much.
To talk with you about this challenging issue in our society. Voy a hablar en español.
I'm going to speak in Spanish, and I'm really grateful for it. I will speak on flexible housing and how to adapt to improve what we consider the housing for the elder. Flexibility is the capacity of a house to be adapted to different lifestyles and needs. These different lifestyles or needs or wishes may be personal, may be cultural, or even professional. Our houses are subject to changes the same as our life and our families. Why is it interesting to study a flexible house? And why is it a novelty, different from conventional traditional houses? Large majority of the buildings we live in are houses whose design depend on a set of regulations regulating how the different spaces in the home and how they are interlinked. These regulations were enacted in the year 48, 69. All subsequent regulations are derived from this main legislation under the Franco regime, Catholic and dictator, and they are thought for a nuclear family, a father, a mother, and obedient children. It was the type of family which was considered unique and desirable at that time. We think it's necessary to overcome this kind of perspective. On one hand, our society has changed. In the last 35 years of democracy, many of the assumptions regarding the behavior of nuclear family have changed, have divorced act, women emancipation, common life within the family is not done only in the living room. We have computers and internet. The members of the family may relate to each other or have a social life not controlled by their parents. Well, there are assumptions that a large majority of families behave like a traditional family in Spain, and this is not a negative thing, but we are not forced to behave that way. Our houses are thought for this, have been conceived for this purpose. There is another factor inviting us to look for new patterns, new models. We behave as nuclear families only during a certain stage of the family cycle. I am forgetting to pass the slides even. This was a traditional house with the spaces, a living room with certain features, a kitchen, and a series of bedrooms with certain characteristics. They have been designed for a nuclear traditional family. And these are all the series of examples of studies done to design a perfect house for each type of family, for its typology. Nowadays, family cycle change, and the stage in which we behave as a nuclear family since the children are born until they become adults, if there are no divorces, is shorter in comparison with the past or with what happens afterwards. To overcome this kind of house, we have flexible houses. Flexibility or flexible house that can be adapted to different lifestyles or habits. We achieve it mainly thanks to two resources. The first one is to change the layout of the house. You can change the layout of the house in an easy way. One of the pioneer examples of this kind of project is the Schroeder house, the Gary Trilbel. There is a Mondrian painting beside this white small house. It's a three-dimensional building made up from the Mondrian painting. This is the neoplasticist movement, architecture, painting, and sculpture. This house was commissioned by a lady living alone with her child and requested the architect a high floor in which partition could be deployed to form separated rooms, or that may be gathered in order to have a single space, a common space. After this, many other examples were built, more or less amazing or useful. This one doesn't seem very useful, but it's funny. In the living room, there is a triedro, a turning triedro like Indiana Jones that allow you to change the function of the living room. One part we may have a piano or a desk or a bed, and then the main character of the room will change. The apartments keep on existing in Berlin, but this geometrical shape didn't last more than 1 year. We have many other examples of this kind of houses, and they allow certain freedom in the use of the house. They are not appropriate for the elder because they need a physical effort to be moving and setting up or dismantling the different scenarios, and secondly because what they offer is this homely place, homely space. The world will change that. My home, I feel protected, I know my environment and I control it. In a changing house, it's for many people there is a confusion of not living in this stable space, which serves as a shelter. A neighbor from the Casa de las Flowers, the Flowers house, I interviewed her very recently, that this house in which the living room can become a bedroom and change partition, she thought they were dreadful. I also have an example of this kind of house in Madrid, very interesting. As you may see in the photograph on the left, on the top left, is an elevated corridor, an inhabitable area. You have to go down the stairs in which the bedrooms are located. Partitions can be folded, dismantled, or removed, and the beds can be kept under the corridor in order to create this clear space. This other example, which seems difficult for the elder, if I am presenting it here, these are different real utilization examples. The more extended is the partitions are open only to allow passage between the different bedrooms, not to change the whole character of the house, but to ease circulation within the home. And that way we enter this other way to create flexibility, which is very interesting for the elderly house. These are passive strategies allowing to change the use of the house in an easy and immediate way, not the shape but the use. Precisely, the easiness, the friendliness, the easiness to circulate, to avoid long itineraries is an important resource when you start a certain physical decline. These are housing from the beginning of from 1910, 1930, middle-class houses in Paris. Was this fill-up circulation. You have seen it in the films many times. Louis XIV walking around the Versailles Palace, crossing the palace, opening the doors directly. There was not circulation corridors. A nuclear house, this conventional house created in the middle of the 20th century. We have now, there is a clear separation between the served spaces, bedrooms, and serving spaces, which are the circulation corridors. We can retake these old models and not only circulate along the corridor, but among the bedrooms. Let's imagine an old person with motion impairments to go from his bedroom to the kitchen, has not to circulate along the whole house full of furniture. In 4 meters, he can go from his bedroom to the living room and to the kitchen. This is what's considered in these Logroño's houses in 2003, in where circulation may be established along the corridor, but also along the facade, directly between the bedrooms and from the living room to the kitchen. And this other example from 1989, the famous Dukenland Torre in Amsterdam, in which the house is a circular space that might be segregated, but you can leave an open and clear space. The separation among bedrooms are not made by walls, that the way of the space is distributed is totally different. When we speak about decline, it's not only physical, but also psychological or mental, and it's very important to avoid isolation, seclusion. We are condemned in a certain way to live in an isolated manner. When we see developments for the elderly or new houses for the elderly, we have semi-detached or line houses. The relation with the outer world is very difficult to be done. It's easy to be done through garden or public spaces, but in collective apartments, there are other solutions. It's a way to establish circulation within the block through galleries. There's a very famous case, Allison and Peter Smithson. So these corridors that give access to every house, when they have a certain dimension, they allow a certain common life and to be inhabited. This is what was considered in a house contest in Switzerland. We were finalists. In the ground floor, you see the different apartments. On the higher corridor provides entrance. There are extended spaces and a large vestibule which allow to open the doors of the house. So the outer space will reach the internal space of the house and allow in exchanges with the rest of neighborhoods, which is very useful for the elderly living alone. Another example, very typical, not only for the elderly, but for life in general. Our life includes changes, as we said. There are flexibilization strategies for a house which may allow us to face these changes in a more comfortable way. There is a very famous building in Madrid, Casa de las Flores, House of the Flowers. These are the different types of polyvalent house. They have a main feature of being made for polyvalent rooms. Sorry, how can I... With the mouse, you can mark. This would be a house. This is a series of bedrooms, all facing the facade with similar dimension and access model very similar, all independent through the corridor, and they have known element that makes the function of the bedroom. The function is not determined. There are not embedded wardrobe or independent bathroom that make a bedroom with, it will be very difficult to use them as living rooms. These are typical houses in Central Europe in between the 19th and the 20th century, and they are impossible due to the Spanish regulations. We cannot repeat the design for social housing. One of the studies we carried out in this building, in the House of the Flowers in Madrid, shows how this kind of versatile housing allows the evolution of the family at the same time that the house evolves. This case, I am presenting the house of a neighbor, 79 years old, a woman who arrived to the building when she was 5 years old. This is the original layout, yellow. They have a living room spaces, in blue the bedrooms. They started living, she and her parents, with a maid. When the father became alone, they changed the living room and the bedroom closer to the entrance in order to ease the itineraries. After, they have two grandchildren staying in the house. When the grandchildren got married, the small girl with her husband, they changed the bedroom and created the bedroom like a professional office. And she now is 79 years. She removes one of the partitions, creating a bigger living room. All this in the same house. The success of this house in this building, it allows all these changes in a very simple and friendly way. Changes are maybe family changes, but also cultural and social changes. Other home model were very common during the 19th century. Was this is a blueprint of a house block. It has a house on the left, another on the right. This is the common stairs, and there is an intermiddle room that may be integrated into the left house or into the right house. As it has a door to the stairs, it can be rented independently. Such a house allows you to face changes that are very common, such as a person who retires, the pension he receives. They have problems to tie the loose ends, and this kind of room allows him to rent one room, and then the use of this bedroom won't overlap with the use of the rest of the house. These divisible houses allow to rent one of the bedrooms, as I mentioned, or to work at home, to create a workshop, to receive customers, and a studio. My grandfather had a milling workshop that he established at home. When he closed, he couldn't market it because people had to go through the kitchen, the corridor, to reach this small workshop. In this house, this could have been possible. Something similar is what we try in this building prize. We were second, Our Lady of the Angels, close to here. The house had access through a common gallery and through a balcony. You can see there, it's an open balcony. It's like an internal yard. And this balcony divides a domestic core and a bedroom that could be segregated. We consider precisely in the cycles of change in the families. How a family, for instance, may receive one of the parents who become widow, and a child who is unemployed and has no money to look for another house to go back to his parents' house. And he can feel a little bit, or he or she can feel a little bit independent with their own space. Lastly, I'm going to give another example in Nantes, in France. Interesting is a social housing price that gather all these characteristics. First, there are like semi-detached houses, intermediate gardens made up by a series of rooms, versatile rooms with the same size, 17 square meters, that may acquire any function, bedroom, living room. They have this green space that can be appropriated by the neighbors. They can cultivate or pave this space, but they can establish relationships with the other neighbors, avoiding isolation or seclusion. Another characteristic is an independent room outside the house, and that allows more free use of this space. This space may be rented or may be integrated to the different houses. You may see in this example to the blue apartment, in the other to the pink or the yellow apartment. To finish, I would like to stress that we are speaking home for aging, and one of the problems why it's difficult to grow older in the house is how the internal spaces are designed, and to create houses not specifically for the elderly, but houses that may accompany us all throughout our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Agatangelo. I think we have had, with these three presentations, three different perspectives on the same topic of the seminar. One with Dean talking about urbanism and third age, another one with Aitor talking about models, groups of housing, and the third one with you, Agatangelo, talking about the housing itself. We will have a debate afterwards, but now we're going to try to connect with Palle Steven. Palle, he's Danish, but he represents a Finnish company settled in Finland, dealing with welfare technologies. Those technologies allow people to stay a few more years at home. They are working in different countries among the Nordic countries and other countries in Europe. So that's why we thought that he could give us a wide perspective of implementation on welfare technologies in different countries. So do we have Palle with us? Fernando? Yes? Hello, Palle. Good morning, and thank you to be with us, for being with us today and sharing this moment. I made a small introduction if you want to say something else, or if you go straight forward to what you were planning to say. Palle? No. Palle, can you hear me? What do we do? Palle? Palle, can you hear me? No, he can't, no? So... Palle?
Yes,
yes, okay. I've been talking about you without you knowing.
I hope you put some nice things.
Okay, what I said, I'm going to repeat that. I was talking with a micro that you couldn't hear, so I just said that you represent a Finnish company with a lot of experience in welfare technologies in different countries of Nordic countries and European countries, and we thought it could be interesting for for us to know what is your perspective on these kind of technologies that allow people to stay a few more years in their own homes. We have not much time, you know, about 5 minutes, okay?
That's okay, yes.
Okay.
So I will start telling a little bit about my experience around in Europe, where, of course, I've been very focused on the North European market. But the North European market is actually not where everything has started with this issue about living home longer. Holland was one of the first countries, together with Scotland. They were looking at possibilities to have elderly people living home longer. One of the things which they did was when they built new blocks of apartment for public, not any particularly like elderly care home or anything, but a normal apartment. Then people in the age of, let's say, 60 or 65, which was planning and preparing themselves a little bit for the elderly time, they could either buy this apartment or rent the apartment, meaning they would have an apartment looking like a normal home. There was no technology visible. And during the time they were living in the apartment, of course, the people were getting older. And then the apartment was prepared with welfare technology to be implemented step by step, meaning that the people could stay in their own apartment, maybe like 10, 15 or 20 years, depending on when they moved in. And this particular area in that block was then becoming similar to a care home, but people were actually living in their own apartment. And I think that was a very good solution, and it's something they have started years ago. And the Nordic markets like Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, they have then followed this up as well. And every country around in Europe are very focused now on this issue, which is, of course, a cost saving to have people living home 2 or 3 or more years. And all of us are, of course, very interested to stay at home because this is our environment. So, of course, we would not mind if we could stay home longer before we were coming to an elderly care home. France have started this senior economy, as they call it, and they are very focused on this area as well. And they also want to do, like I explained, to find solution how we can have people living home longer. And for them, they say very clearly, it's for the rest of Europe, it's a cost saving. The governments or the municipalities and society cannot, they don't have the money to cover all the costs if we all have to go on care homes. And therefore, everyone is looking for option for like this. And this is what they're doing in France. Right now, they have the government have put extremely a lot of money to start looking how they can develop and have the people living home longer. Welfare technology is one of the solutions. There is a lot of investigation, like I know you guys have been doing. But one thing is from, how can I say, discover what are the issues and what are the problems, but then what we need to do is to go to action. And some of the action is, of course, using welfare technology, as it's called today. And there is a various of product on the market, and I recommend every one of you to try and talk with some municipalities who have done maybe pilots, because there are many products, and of course we are one of them, and I will not disclose our product here now because that's not the issue. But always listen to others that have done pilot with products, get good feedback, get the experience, and listen to what they have discovered of good things and bad things, and then work further from there before going into a full rollout in a country. that's more or less what I have to say, and I'm happy to answer any question if there's anyone that have any questions.
Pale?
Yes?
The name of the company is, I wasn't sure. Is it Elsie, the company you represent?
Yes, my company, our company is called LC Technologies, and we are located with our head office in Finland, Helsinki.
Okay. Well, Pale, you're going to stay with us for the debate, are you?
Yes, I will stay here. Unfortunately, I can't stay too long because I'm a very busy man, as you know.
Okay.
I will stay as long as I can, and maybe in half an hour or something like that.
It will be just 20 minutes. We have 20 minutes. So I would like to start the debate because I was interested in making a reflection on the three perspectives you have been putting forward today. You have told us what is it happening now concerning urbanism, concerning groups of houses, and concerning houses itself. But I would like to ask the three of you, how do you see the future? What is it going to happen in the future? So, Eitor. Yeah.
Well, I think that the first thing it will be that we have to have the right to choose, in the sense that right now in Spain we cannot choose. So I think that the first thing will be that if you want to live like in a caravan like in the United States, it will be okay. But if you want to live in a house which is adapted to your necessities, it should be a right here in Spain. That's like, in my opinion, like the main thing with housing, the right to choose, which means that we have to provide these kind of models. And it's something that I got told about. It's like actually the regulation here in Spain doesn't allow us to make different houses more adapted to the necessities of the people, like elderly people or any other kind of people. So I think that it would be nice to make this specific or specialized housing that I was talking about. It would be nice to make them or to normalize them so they will be part of the mainstream housing models. I think that would be really good, actually.
I don't really have a magic answer for what the future will be like, unfortunately, but from my perspective, I see many kind of severe challenges. I think one of the largest challenges I think has been kind of touched upon is this question about as a result of aging in place, and we see at the same time aging of urban areas, that basically we find many older people living in physically relatively isolated contexts with little in the way of amenities, particularly, let's say, in much of the housing built at a lower density after the Second World War in different contexts. So from my perspective, I see many challenges also attached to the way of aging in place as a kind of orthodoxy addressing how one deals with housing for the aged. I think Heitor's point, I would very much agree with this notion of choice, but also the idea of diversity of offers and possibilities. But this also, I think, is extremely challenging in the context, let's say, of the kind of national fiscal discussions around aging populations. So for me, I think that the future should also deal with how to allow for potentials that are dealing with, that are addressing not only, let's say, the middle socioeconomic groups, but also those with little resources and little support. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges that is not clear how to answer at this point. Yeah.
I'm very optimistic with the future because in this society post-bubble we live in, we don't need more housing. We have built all the housing we needed and more. So next development will be of more quality. I was thinking, when I was coming here, I was thinking in the case of my parents and the case of my parents-in-law. They both live in their apartment blocks, They bought their apartments when they were in their 30s, when the children were little, and all the neighbors did the same. They have age all at the same time, and now all the in the two examples, both of the apartment blocks are housing for the elderly, because all the proprietaries, all the owners are elder people. So what is the difference between their housing and a specialized housing? I think the most important is in the way the common spaces and their apartments interior are designed. If they don't felt isolated inside their apartments, they could discover that they live in a community with people very, very similar to them, and easily adapted to their necessities. So I think this is gonna be easier in the years that are to come.
I think we can open now the questions, comments that you want to do from the... I will translate, traduciré las preguntas para ellos en inglés.
I will translate the questions into English. If you want to ask questions, if you do want to ask questions, please raise your hand, and we will pass the microphone along.
Vale, pues Rosa.
Okay, Rosa, then.
En Twitter, ¿hay alguien? Sí, vale.
Is there someone
micrófono.
Here who wants to ask questions? Yes, they will give you a microphone.
Hacer la pregunta en inglés, mejor.
Oh, you're going to ask a question in English? That'd be grand, but if not, I can translate it. Good morning, everyone. I'd rather ask a question in Spanish, if that's all right, and if you don't understand it, then I'll say it in English. It's not really a question, it's an intervention, because I'm an architect, and I got I was awarded by Conectividad, the Association Conectividad, and the director of Ceapat was amongst the jury members. And we treated this topic of housing for the elderly, and we thought of what Eitar said at the beginning. We thought about why the most important thing is about being independent, and in the last few moments when you become dependent, that's when you need other people. But your housing should cover all of those needs, all of those day-to-day things that are quite simple, so that you may have an independent, autonomous life. And we also thought about having housing that were flexible and that would evolve with us. So as we grow older, or as we advance in life, then our housing should adapt to our needs with small solutions with regards to accessibility, for instance, illuminating in orange walls in case you start losing sight, or having the possibility of carrying our oxygen without tripping on it, so that we could also have handrails in case you were losing stability. Those would be improvements that are not very costly, that would make our life easier, much more comfortable. And there was something that I found very interesting, which is the fact that currently, with regards to accessibility, what we understand as accessibility, we always talk about losing physical capacities. So there is always the possibility of having wide enough corridors for wheelchairs, but we never talk about cognitive loss or sensorial losses, which are things that we all are going to feel at our last years, such as losing memory, losing sight, and I think that we as architects should consider that when designing housing. We should include that. And I also wanted to say that there are many young architects who are very interested in this topic, and it is a pity that it always ends up being just an idea, and we can't ever create prototypes. I'm not just talking about housing itself, but prototypes, so that we could investigate research in that regard.
Rosa, preguntas de momento no, seguro que luego
I'm sure no questions right now. I'm sure there will be later on.
Hola.
Hello. Yes, I changed. We have had some interventions in the social networks, and since no one wants to take the floor here, I will be asking some of those questions. First one, why don't we train people with regards to human capacities and capabilities in architecture universities? And another question that we thought was interesting is whether there are scientific research with regards to the advantages of different housing typologies for the elderly, and if there is some sort of indicator that could measure that situation, that could really measure that situation. And another question that we have highlighted is that which wonders how we can really know what the needs of the elderly are. How do they get their needs to be heard by the architects who will be designing their homes? For whomever wants to answer this question. I could maybe answer the first and last questions. I think that somehow we do train in architecture schools or universities, but we don't train in that very specific field, precisely because it is very specific. And training is usually quite general when you're at school, when you're still in the architecture school. We have the tendency to specialize when you already became an architect, and that is what is happening right now. That's a debate that is right now in the midst of the architectural forum. As you said, there are many young architects who are interested in this. I'm actually very surprised by having so many young architects present in seminars such as this one. So I see that this is a thing that is being debated. It is a social problem that is being now felt in the profession. So I think it is a long process, and Spain is lagging behind in that sense. But I think that we are beginning. So my answer is as positive as it can be, really. I'd like to answer to the last question that has been asked. How can we tell what the elderly want? Well, by asking them, obviously. That's why we're architects, and we're not software programs that would vomit traditional housings or housing models. All the examples of promotion where the users are part of the design of housing or public spaces, so the environment where we want to live. The problem that we have faced in all of this experience ever since the 60s all over Europe is that usually they are a failure for the second generation of user. So when the first user abandons the home or the house, whether because they move or because they're dead, well, or because they live somewhere else and they have to move, someone else will come along, and that user has not participated in the procedure, in the design process, and they find themselves in a house that was created by someone else for someone else. And in that sense, it is important for architects not just to listen to our clients, but we also have to make studies, we have to research, not to have average models or types of housings that will always be successful, but rather to learn what are the trends of use for those housings, what people expect from them, how can they change from one user to the next. That is what we started doing when we created this series of assessments, these post-occupancy evaluations. They're interviews where we study the evolution that the houses have gone through and the users that families have given it. And that allows us to know firsthand with less prejudice with regards to how families work and how housing works, so that we have a larger open vision on how we can improve the habitat of these people. Nieves, there is a question in the room. There is a gentleman behind the cameras. And there is another question here. Could you please raise your hand? Yes? No, it's not really a question. It's rather just telling you that we don't have to go all the way to Nordic countries to enjoy those housing experiences that they have shown us. In La Vera, in Extremadura, we already have that. That's all I wanted to say. Have you heard about that? Yes, there are some initiatives. Yes, they exist. I'm really sorry, but no microphone is being used. Use the microphone because otherwise it can't be translated. Our problem in our country is not about building housing. I think we have professionals that are very qualified and specialized to do so. The problem is the culture of our elderly population. That's all I wanted to say. What do you mean by that? My home. And turning that new house into their home is something that is very, very hard for elderly Spaniards and for their families. That's the main problem we face. Thank you very much. Nieves, I believe there is a question that Miguel Ángel wanted to ask a question. There are more questions, I believe. Just a second, Miguel Ángel.
Sí. En fin, estoy entusiasmada.
I'm thrilled to see so many people here, all these people who have been making presentations. But I wanted to say that 50 years ago, we conceived and we saw that what you are talking about here had to be done. And we did that 25 years ago in Malaga. We created a cooperative, an association, with a group of friends who wanted to self-manage our own future. And this group of friends started working in this cooperative. We built some land. We purchased some land and we built our own residential home. And we have been living there for 14 years now. Everything that you have said here is that we wanted to do, and it's what we want to do. Even the last thing that you have mentioned, changing homes. In these apartments, we allow for the new person to modify that which they think they have to modify. So we have been here for 14 years as a cooperative in Andalusia, in Malaga. This was initiated in Spain, and this has given place to other projects that are also taking place here in Madrid, in Santander, in Avila, in Malaga. We were pioneers in a sense, not just in Spain. This was then disseminated to many other countries, and it became an international model. Thank you very much. Santa Clara. Santa Clara is the name of this residential home or group of homes. I wanted to link this to the previous intervention, to José Antonio's intervention, who explained to us that the problem is not just the home itself with regards to which one's your home, but what happens around the home. What's the environment? What's your neighborhood? What's your community? That will have an influence in your well-being when you grow older. And that is why Aitor's models are those self-management models, self-design models. Those are the clearest reference to enter those models of redesigning current housing facilities. So when Antangelo was talking about families who live in a residential area, they have no reference whatsoever with regards to managing that house, how to create new community areas, how to fix their homes to, I don't know, for instance, have rooms to rent for students and so on. So self-managed models are clearly the reference that will allow us to refurbish all of the houses that we have, all the housings that we have, because that will be the simplest way of doing it. But our main objective will be to have those fifth-generation models, which is I stayed in my home, and my building block creates enough intergenerational relations for an elderly people not to have to leave the area and to keep on having community services so that they aren't isolated, so they aren't alone. So it's not just refurbishing one apartment. And that can't be linked to community activities. Those are not parallel things. Obviously, we need to have some sort of patch and intermediate solution. And the objective is for people to be integrated in their communities, not just in an adapted house. And we have made many efforts in that sense, but people can still be isolated. So I think I have the feeling that when these models, the senior resort models, appear, for instance, the ones that our Danish colleague has presented to us, I think that that isn't still, it's not in the family of what an administration could provide or would find desirable. If there isn't participation by the neighbors, then we know that active aging will be impacted. I know that senior resorts are easier to be done. Someone with money creates this resort as we know it, and as I've been told by some promoters, they say, I don't want ambulances there and I don't want to see any undertakers there. This is something that has a lot to do with real estate activities. So, and if something happens, I will hide it so that no one can see that. Those, I believe, are models that exist, but that are not the models that we consider that should be recommended. Can you introduce yourself? I'm sorry, my name is Miguel Ángel Miras. I am an architect and I am the president of the Association Jubilares, retirees, you could call it. And we work so that there could be self-managed communities for the elderly.
Busy, sé que Pal está ocupado, entonces voy a hacer una pregunta.
No, Pal is busy. I'm going to ask a question.
Why, Pale, do you think that we are so far away in the implementation of technologies in our houses in order to stay longer? We have been trying to find experiences, pilot experiences, and it was really difficult to see something already being done in this welfare technologies. Nobody is using them. Is it because we are not so trained in technology? Why do you think you have an idea of what that could be?
I think, not thinking, I know, there are many countries that have started already implementing welfare technology where they're doing pilots, and I know for sure Holland is one of them, and Denmark is another country. They have also started some after the Holland started. And there are many municipalities in Denmark which has been looking into this because they are aware of that they need the welfare technology. It's not the issue are not solved by itself, but what is most common why things are not moving, I think, is very much due to the financial. People have to invest in it, and if the governments are not back behind it, then it's very difficult. All countries, all municipalities around are struggling with the finance, and they have to have a help to get started. And then the municipality, they will see the cost saving in like return of investment, and they will save cost. And that's what we have to focus on. So get it started, get it implemented, get, how can I say, more pilots out so that we get more experience with the different products. There is a lot of welfare technologies out there, and all companies, like our company, is developing product, but it's always best to do pilot, and check what is the best solution.
¿Más preguntas había?
Solo quería decir que también esta experiencia existe ya en la Comunidad de Madrid. Nosotros formamos parte del Centro de Mayores Travensol
in Torremocha del Jarama, where not only put in common several accessible and comfortable houses, but the idea on our philosophy is not only alone, only when we are in bad condition, but go to live there to share an active life, participate in things in the town, in our environment, and making other other people, participants of the activities we develop. This is our reality. We have been 10, 12 years since we started with the idea as a cooperative with friends and friends of friends, and we have been living there for 1 year and a half in these houses.
Gracias. Cristina.
Thank you, Christine.
Cristina, chicas.
And in fact, I am really delighted with this discussion. What I'm going to raise goes a little bit far away from the main topic of person getting united to create. I will go back to the adaptation of houses. I've been very interested to know more about these experiences, but going back to the house adaptation in already existing houses, downtown cities, we don't give enough importance, and this is a bad thing, a bad aspect of Spain, to common areas. Many houses, there are like roof balconies that could be refurbished or recreated in order to be meeting points. This happened in the past. It's a vintage effect. Some people gather in the roof of the house. They don't have as many resources. We need to be humble and to learn to better use common spaces we already have. We have to take advantage of these common spaces, to have good opportunities, to take advantage myself. For instance, have a son living in Toronto when it's really cold. All the balconies are conditioned to have a life there. In Spain, we have a very good weather. Most of the rooftops are not to utilize, but we don't never put our clothes to get dried there, and they are underutilized. It's a pity not to be able to use all these common spaces. I can describe many other examples. We need to be humble and to see what spaces we can take advantage of for common life, for parties, for many other things. And I would like to make this comment. Thank you. We continue with the questions and answers. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Simpson, especially because I draw the attention, the examples you gave so spectacular on decisions taken by the elder to live their lives. The case of Europe in the Costa del Sol, the Sun Coast, all the Mediterranean coast. It's surprising to give me an explanation why this migration movement, which is contradictory with some of the topics we are explaining here, is not only in Spain. In France, there is a migration movement of the elder from the north to the Mediterranean coast. At least in principle, these movements and these areas didn't exist the same public services as in Sweden or Denmark or Germany. The public services, our bed health system is similar, more or less. I don't know how the Danish health system is. From the social perspective, there are handicaps, language hindrance. You are far away from your family, and nevertheless, the elder take the decision to comply their Ethiopia, to live in the country of holidays and vacations. It has more weight, the weather, the possibility to be every day in the open, to enjoy the beach, and other considerations that may be important for the old age. If some of you could go deeper and give an explanation for this. I am also surprised. The issue of loneliness of the elder, the next generation they are going to have an advantage. Which are the new technologies. One of the American RV, the elderly in the future won't have this loneliness they have the old people now. I think they will be potential users of the internet, and they will be connected to their family, to their grandchildren. We will be connected with to Facebook, social network or association. This is a huge advantage that socialize the elder without needing to go out from home. I don't know if it's also a disadvantage. In principle, it's an advantage. You are not commented. You can only create a community when you go out from home. You have social networks much more intense from their computers at home. Only this. Thank you. Before answering, I would like to say goodbye to Pablo.
We hope to see you again around here.
Thank you very much, and I wish you all a nice continue on your conference. I think I have my partner by you right now, Monster, and I'm sure she will be happy also to support if there's any question. Thank you very much. Take care all. Bye-bye.
Shall I answer the question? I think it's a very good question, and I think that in my work, let's say my background, of course, is as an architect and urbanist, not as an ethnographer or anthropologist. But of course, my work is in some ways drawn on the work of ethnographers who have been working in the field in Costa del Sol, and that has been quite interesting. And of course, they give someone, for example, like Karen O'Reilly, who's done a lot of work in Costa del Sol, largely looking at the British residents there. She talks, of course, about the dimensions of the role of the climate, also the idea of the personal history of generations who experienced their own holidays during their middle age and youth in Spain as, let's say, the kind of charter holiday market expanded, as this kind of holiday industry expanded on the coast of Spain. So, of course, this is connected to a kind of personal biography or a kind of career of leisure time. She speaks also, of course, about the idea of a kind of the will toward a notion of freedom attached to being in an environment in which one doesn't experience the seasons in the same way. There are many, I think, explanations that align to what you're talking about, I think, are close. Of course, it's very much possible to challenge or question this vision for society and this vision for how one should live during one's retirement. I think this, for me, before I went there and before I talked to many people, for me, I was much more puzzled about it, but of course, understanding the work of O'Reilly, and when I was there, I was actually quite, let's say, it gave me quite an impression from people I spoke to about their desire to be there, not only in terms of how they were really finding quality in their life, also in terms of personal health. For many of them, they spoke about how, for various complaints that they have that are about rheumatism, arthritis, and so on, for them, these were very important environments that helped them in these terms. So I think that for me, it was a much more kind of complex issue than a kind of escapism into a kind of never-ending holiday, although, of course, for many, there was that sense. What you mentioned, this notion of connectivity, I think is very important. The idea of different technologies that we could also discuss in terms of the notion of welfare technologies, of course, ranging from the telephone to Skype and to other forms of communication. Also, of course, the low cost of air travel that allows extended families to come and visit many of these people who are living on Costa del Sol. So I think that this notion of a kind of pure isolation or escapism, in many cases of those that I spoke to, of course, there is a kind of contact that takes place through remote technologies, but also, of course, through visits that are enabled by less and less expensive mobility over long distances. But of course, this raises the question, is this a society that we want to promote? Is this a society that we want to become? And from my perspective, there are many deeply problematic aspects about how this is constructed as a product from the perspective of the developer, but also how it produces a kind of denial about the final phase of life that is obviously very difficult to cater for, as you point out, for this age group that enters into a period of frailty, a period in which they become more dependent, they have many more problems as they become much more aged. And of course, this usually translates into either a kind of a very awkward translation and access to local services in a Spanish context. For many people this is very difficult, and in most cases the notion of a return home, which is seen as, for many of these people, a kind of a terrible outcome, because it not only is about returning home, but it's largely about the idea of dependency, forcing on them something that they're not really able to decide themselves. And I think that this is one of the aspects that relates, I think, to the talks of the other two architects here, that of course the question of flexibility, of the potential for one's living condition to be adaptable to different contexts, is something that this kind of foregrounds and highlights. So I would just end it there, because I keep rambling on. Thanks.
Vamos muy mal de tiempo. Yo creo que podemos, como va a continuar la jornada, podemos hacer el descanso
Now we are
para ceñirnos más al
going to
programa
the
y
break
después
to respect the schedule, and we will have more questions and answers.
hay un descanso
There
de
is
20
a
minutos.
20-minute break.
Durante el descanso,
During the break, for people following us through streaming, they will see several videos, and during the last minute we will have the participation of Carlos Sánchez Martin, who will present the Observatory for Housing by Foundation Once Fermi and Via Libre. Thank you very much. Accessibility in Spain. Lastly, transversal way, we create discussion groups, two groups, one for disabled people, another without disabilities, and deep interviews with experts of the industry regarding the conclusions of the observatory. Is the first, there is a lack of universal accessibility in housing. I'm going to show you a graph. As I was saying, we inhabit houses without universal accessibility. We will find graphs like this one in the book, speaking about accessibility for common areas. In the entrance to the house block is not very accessible. The graph here, we have 53% of the surveyed people thought that the access entrance gate can be easily utilized. 3 parameters: width, free width for the passage mechanism. It was easy to use and not to have an excessive weight in the door. 42% identified level access resolved with an alternate ramp with accessibility features. 36% and 7% identified automated gates and video porters at an adequate height, easy to use. Only 2% comply with the 4 characteristics of accessibility. That is, only 2% comply with the universal accessibility criteria. As a conclusion, is a comparison between a technical assessment carried out by the expert and the surveyed profession. In all the fields, we conclude that the houses are perceived by users as more accessible than what is established in the regulation. The potential likely reasons is the lack of knowledge by the surveyed of the real needs of regarding the building design. I speak about universal accessibility characteristic and how badly we are used to do over efforts compensating a bad design. We internalize this excessive effort and we don't give any importance to it. Last, in Spain, there is a very not varied offer which don't respond to the needs, accessibility needs of all the people. Regarding the demand, when we buy a house, we don't value the accessibility characteristics. In Spain, we buy many houses, and generally we buy for all our life, for all the lifetime, taking into account that this personal situation is going to change as long as I grow older. We don't consider the distribution of the different spaces, the bathroom, if I have to change the bathroom, the lifts, the different access doors, and so on. To finish, recommendations studied by this observatory: first, to invest in training for future professionals, architects, engineers. It's crucial to understand why accessibility, not to make mistakes in design and execution. Training for the technicians and public managers, that they grant the license to build. Lastly, for the responsible of the final product, the developers and builders. Second line of recommendation would be to advance in the regulation. In Spain, there are 17 autonomous legislations for accessibility. It has no sense that a disabled person may face a building design which is different depending on the autonomous community in which he lives. First, to unify access, local and autonomous local regulations, and the building technical code, which is a state regulation. Third recommendation would be to promote social participation through cooperative networks, including the elder, professionals, neighbor community collectives, and persons with disability, even at local level, to know the opinion of all. Lastly, to celebrate seminars and congresses. This book is published in www.fundacion11.es. Nothing else, and thank you for your attention. Bye.
Hola, buenos días.
Hello, good morning. Well, actually, the seminar is being very interesting, and the level of participation is actually growing as well. And this last panel, this third panel, deals with, I believe, the most important part of them all, which is what it is that we want, to have an opinion, to comment on those designs that have been proposed to us, so that we can say what our opinions are. I know that those of you present here are qualified to be speakers as well. Some of you have quickly told us about your experience, but during this morning session we have these three speakers, not many speakers, but a very high value. I am going to introduce to you Carlos Martínez Ascari, who is a vice technician of the UDP. You know that that is the Democratic Union of Retirees of Spain. It is the greater confederation of the elderly here in Spain, and it joins over 1.5 million members through the different associations that it represents. I have to my left, to my far left, Ana García Bernal, who's an economist. She works in a consultancy office, and she is still active. And here to my left is Birte Brenner. I won't be able to say her surname. Brenner. My surname is Brenner. Birte has been working for a very long time at the Danish embassy here in Spain, and during those years she had tried to provide a bond or contact, a communication channel between Denmark and Spain, and she's explained those products that they have in Denmark that could provide us with solutions. And she's now a retiree, she's now retired, and she has tried to apply the theory that we're trying to put in place here to foresee that independent life for when we grow older. And first of all, Carlos is going to make a presentation, and then we will establish a dialogue on some of the topics that have been tackled during today's work. Carlos, I give you the floor. Good morning. I would like to thank Ceapat for inviting us, for inviting the UDP here. As Nieves has already told you, we are a confederation that was born with democracy in this country. We are quite old. We represent many associations all over Spain, and we also represent associations of Spaniards who have migrated, who went to Germany, Switzerland, France. They also belong to UDP. And we also have retirees the other side of the Atlantic. We have people in Uruguay and Peru, elderly people who are members of our association. I think that there isn't much to be said beyond what has already been said. We were talking about a place where we could grow old, but if you'll allow me, I'd like to invert the order of the terms. So grow old, but in which home? Considering that homes are something that go beyond housing, because I wouldn't want to frame home in the architectural context, because we all know that it goes beyond that. And when you remember your home, your environment, your family, from an emotional point of view, you never talk about housing. You almost don't remember the physical space, the exact physical space where you lived in your childhood. What you remember is that it was your home. So it's about deciding where or how we want to grow older. The concept of the elderly, as it has already been mentioned by the two professors this morning, is linked to the term of being retired, of retirement. And retirement in Spanish comes from jubilee, so it has to do with enjoyment, with joy, with happiness. But we have seen lately in this last few years that this term has been modified, and it is now being enlarged or being a bit more flexible. We see that we are going to have to work longer. We're going to retire later. The public pension system is going to break down, and the lobbies tell us that this is unsustainable, and this is creating fear, isn't it? And the term elderly is also evolving. It's evolving under the light of these words. So this is somehow increasing, and we see that people are now living longer, so the active part of our life is increasing. And I don't know if you've seen that too, but we in the 80s and in the 90s we saw that the youngsters, we never knew when that limit was set, because a town hall would say that you were young when you would stop being young when you were 25, and then there was another government and they said that you stopped being young when you were 30, and when you weren't 30 anymore, you weren't young, or you still were young. It depended. And now we see commercially that there are many places where the elderly and the term of being retiree is going down. It's going down from 65 to 60 and from 60 to 55, and now we see that in many leisure goods they say that it's 50 or over. So the term elderly or old goes from 50 to to much beyond that. So this is showing us a different landscape, a completely different landscape. And when we talk about the elderly and when we talk about older people, and we've already seen the figures, is not only evolving in figures, but it's also evolving with society itself. We see that certain elements have given us some interesting brushstrokes. Technological advance have allowed us for an evolution of speed, a very speed evolution, and this has also allowed for an aging that is healthier, so that we can live many more years but healthier. And we also have seen that we have broken the traditional molds of family, and there are certain elements that change our family models. We now have monoparental families, we have homosexual families, we have all sorts of families. So this concept of family has also changed, and that's where we are immersed, all of us who are going to become old and those who are old right now, and and obviously the environment has also changed. And we were saying that the environment is not just the family or the people closer to us in that traditional nucleus that we have seen up till not long ago. The environment is much larger than that, and it has to do with the environment and with material elements, but also it has to do with people. And this retirement with a good health allows us to have people such as Angelina and members of associations who are present here today, who obviously, from the moment they retired, have seen their environment much larger. We have many friends from UDP who tell us that they're working much more now that they retired than when they were still active. And that is a reality that we are all seeing right now. So housing, obviously, has also evolved, especially because up till now, 85% of the elderly, and this is the white book that we mentioned previously, are the owners of their houses, and this is a phenomenon that is quite specific to Spain. Not long ago, until the bubble has bursted, our parents, our grandparents have always taught us that was basic was to buy a house. And that obviously has brought forth all the problems that we have recently lived through. But that couple, old person, owner of his or her house, has always been there, but it is now going to be broken, and that is creating a problem, a different problem, because many people who are now thinking of living their old age or their retired years have still that support, that real estate support. But in a few years' time, many people will get to their retired ages without being owners of a house. And this bubble in Spain has favored something that was a right recognized in the Constitution, and it now has become a problem, a luxury that many people won't be able to benefit from. And I don't know if the public institutions and professional associations have considered that this is a social problem that we will be facing not long from now, and that will have an impact on the model that we have to set with regards to aging. Will we be aging in a certain way depending on our taste, or will it be dependent on the resources that we each have? Because if we consider that the public pensions and subsidies will not reach a minimum that will allow us to live in a dignified way, in a just way. So the landscape is becoming quite grim. In 10, 15 years' time, it all will be a bit darker than we expected it to be. We have been seeing an immense amount of changes. I'm only 55, but I've seen that communication technologies in only 10 years have evolved in a spectacular way. And in the last 20 years, even more. So the technological race in which we have been included somehow has allowed for us to enter a productivist and consumer model without really asking us whether everything that is being invented, everything that ads are offering us are really going to improve our life, are really useful things, or if they have left final consumers and consumers aside because no one has really asked us whether we needed this. So this magical invention of what's new, this has been mentioned by a previous speaker, has led to a negative effect. This adjective, new, was the magic word, because when you stick that word beside whatever product, new, changes it all. Maybe they simply change the packaging, but that adjective, new, has hypnotized us and has been hypnotizing us for a very long time. And in that race where we are always praising the bounty of the new and where we have been leaving aside everything that was old, has finally polluted the human environment. And what's new is what's worthy, what's new is what sells, and what's obsolete is what needs to be left aside. And we need to think about program obsolescence as well. Nothing is to be manufactured if it will last over 4 to 5 years. And this is a consequence of a productive model that doesn't take into account resources and the limits of our own planet that is generating so much residue. And we all are seeing that any element that we choose, and we always listen to our grandmothers say that, our parents say, well, we had a fridge that worked for 20 years. That car, remember that car, how long we'd used it, but now after 5 years everything's old, it needs to be thrown away and we need to buy something new. And in this process, in this society that has really coined that importance of the new and left aside the old, we see that old people are no longer useful because it's very much linked to usefulness. And we see that many companies, services and goods companies, consider us as final consumers for goods and services that someone, we don't know who, has invented, but they invented it to make money, but they don't design them for us. They design many different products. We see it every day on the ads, but no one has ever thought of the elderly. Have they ever considered the needs of the elderly? Have they ever asked the elderly what they needed? This boom and the development of initiatives, we have been looking at a video, domatization initiatives, technology elements where they make things easy for people, has been a boom that we also lived here in Spain in the last few years. We, UDP, have participated in certain projects that have to do with this. And I just wanted to tell you an anecdote. We started in 2007 in a project where we tried to create a pilot, because there's also been an architect who talked about the importance of developing pilots. I'm going to be a bit more critic with that regard, because we have, for a very long time in Europe, investing immense amounts of money to develop products and services and technological inventions and pilots, and those pilots are finally in some drawer, completely forgotten, and much money had been spent in those, but they will never serve the people. And in this project, we realized, with you at home, we realized that a domotic project with many devices to measure the presence and habits of people, which was a project that was thought to check upon a series of devices. The reason of developing this was very, very expensive. It was very costly because we had to develop an intelligent software and so on. And we realized that our elderly, the people who participated in this project in many homes, that which they really liked was video conference calls. So being in contact on a daily basis, not just with the control center or the accompanying center, but with the other users of the project. And that's how certain people started communicating from Valencia to Alicante, Albacete with Alicante, and they started talking to one another. And one of the people who was amongst the audience talked about that. So the importance of that project, which I call technology of small things, was that we were capable, or the people were capable, of discovering other people and start communicating with them and breaking that feeling of isolation and loneliness. And this project with you at home, Contigo en Casa, which we are still leading thanks to the subsidy that we got by IRPF, we have many elderly people who are video connected with other people, with their families and so on. So we need so many things Do we really need so many things, or do we let that biased vision take hold of us and we only see the elderly as dependent people? There are many designers and many people, many companies who only think about us as dependent, and they spend lots of resources, lots of effort, lots of their work in developing those devices. And this is where I ask myself, is accessibility or autonomy something that will only depend of the money or resources that each person has when they retire? I think that in that sense, we see that we have to review our models and our lifestyles, because what we are facing is something greater, much greater than what could simply be the adaptation or refurbishment of a house. That transformation of the environment is also the transformation of your social environment and your interaction environment. Participatory processes, as Miguel Ángel was saying, are the key to designing those future landscapes. And in order to finish my presentation, I'd like to say that we've sometimes said this. There are two main challenges that humankind is facing. The first one is the aging of population, and the other one is climate change. You might think that one is not linked to the other, but I do think that they are closely linked, because up till now, aging as well as climate change, we have seen, are only seen as a problem by newscasts, by movies that we watch on TV. News with regards to the future that awaits are becoming less and less positive. But we don't see that opportunity for change and global transformation that this entails. We have to set 4 main steps. First of all, stop this crazy speed in which the world of technology and technological advances have started. All this publicity to maintain the consumption model that we have right now. We have to design, produce, consume, throw away, and start again. We have to stop. From the aging point of view as well as from the climate change point of view, we have to rethink what brought us here and what direction are we following. Where do we want to go to? What world do we want? We, the elderly people, as well have to see that. What is the world that we want to live for our grandchildren to live in? What spaces do we want to provide them with? Once we rethink all of these things, then we have to design. We have to design future landscapes, but not short-termish landscapes. Even politics that change every 4 years have made us comfortable in those 4-year scenarios, and we have to think in the long term. Only when that is fixed will we be able to act. And I always talk about the World Forum of Aging, which took place in 2002 in Madrid. I'm sure that many of you remember that forum. Since then, many different studies have been carried out in Europe, globally, or in municipalities and regions about what aging means. We have many different studies. When are we going to start acting, considering those studies that have been carried out? Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I think you have done a wonderful summary of everything that has been said. Yes, I'm the one I'm the clock master. Key elements that I'm sure would give place to lots of other seminars, and we might even have the opportunity of organizing those said seminars. But I would like now to give the floor to Birte and Anna, and for that to happen, I'm going to ask him a series of questions and another question to you too as well. So it's 4 groups of questions. First of all, I'd like to say that the collective of the elderly people is growing. It's growing in numbers, but we also realize that it is a collective that is very well prepared. It is a group of people who are very well trained. Never had it been so trained as it is right now. And I'm not just talking with regards to knowledge, but also with regards to decision-making capabilities, which is the most important aspect of them all. And I wanted to ask you if this group is homogeneous, according to you, because you were talking about age 50, 55, 65, or should we set the bar if their demands or if their needs are homogeneous as well, and how do these demands get to us, those needs, how are they transferred to us, through whom, through which people, and if that communication is somehow misinterpreted due to interferences in the road.
What I would say is, as Jose Antonio Serra said, there are not two equal persons, but there are subsets of the elder that are more or less homogeneous. Therefore, there can be identified as persons who need certain social services. What Carlos said, that the elderly are associated to dependent people, is a great barrier, because from 60, 65, wherever we set the limit until we die, we can die at 90, is a long time. Where dependency, you arrive there in the final stretch. This management of this stretch of our life or stage of our life, how do we want to live this period of our life? We take this decision when we are 55 or later. It's too late. All this planning, all this transmission of the communication of the needs, how we want to materialize these needs. Or we start earlier or we'll arrive late. We lose our capacity to adapt, to take decisions. That's a little bit what I totally agree with this. Could you hear me? When I was 57 or so, I took the decision to plan my own life, what would be the rest of my life. Then I live in a big apartment with garden, swimming pool, playgrounds for kids. I started checking ads, downtown Madrid, renewal of old buildings. And I started on the way I ended in a renewed house. As it was under construction, I was able to design my house as I wished. This way, it's a luxury. It was a luxury. It's a very nice experience, very enthusiastic. I left my house for a long time, and now I'm old enough to a lot of years to live ahead with my neighbors and the shops around. So if you can, I recommend to plan this ahead. But it's difficult. As we said, there are those in the rural areas and the urban areas, and we are used to live in a different way. If we are used to live in a city, we must be able to participate in all the cultural offers existing in the cities. You need to have a metro station, bus stops, in order to ease your mobility. I would like also to deal with the issue of, in Denmark, with all the subsidies they have. It's a little bit like here. These are the municipalities review you, decide what do you need, for how long, how many times a week or throughout the day. And another good thing about Denmark is they give you a bed. It's like a hospital bed, specialized for the staff providing the care. The bed has the right height, so the carers, it's easier for the carers to provide care to you. In Denmark, they borrow you all the fittings, they provide you all the subsidies. even electrical wheelchairs, if you are able to ride them. You must recognize that the offer is very wide, the technological aids that are at your service, that are provided to you. Another aspect is to be the green areas. Also there is something in Denmark. Many people have summer houses that are small houses, wooden houses in the middle of the countryside. And then in Denmark, a law was enacted that you have had this house for 8 years. When you retire, you can go there and have it as your residence. And this is changing the problems, because there are municipalities with only summer population. They start having residential inhabitants during all year. But people Danish are more in the green areas, and this is a good aspect. We are a much more urban country. On what you said, I would like to underline certain ideas, homogeneous group, so regarding certain factors, regarding others not. It's a diverse group. We are precursors of adopting pioneers of planning when you were able to take decisions. But it's important for me to know if at that moment of taking the decision you found in your environment the option you were looking for. If it's possible to find sufficient and different and diverse options for each of our choices. I think there are 3 problems. First, there is not enough information on the alternatives and their cost and how to finance them. Then there are no alternatives. If you don't have sufficient data to take the decision, there are no alternative options. Secondly, we have a privileged audience. We have a lot of responses that are here in groups which are present, individual responses which are not global responses nor social responses from the group which is in the need, nor the ones who collectively, as a country, we have the need to assume things that require a cultural change. There are things, as I said, a human said, they are hard to accept when we need to accept them. What happens is there are changes that will take place anyway, the change of the social security systems. For resident nursery homes, even in Uruguay, it's already happening. With 8 million inhabitants, you have an insurance from the 65. You have a nursery home, a list of nursery homes, which is not the best solution, but I'm not assessing, but they consider the collective and they provide options to this age group, not to offer options, as Carlos said, to push the options. No, these are the options, and the demand must choose. Not only in a solvable way, they need to pay it, because not all the sub-segments are going to have the same purchase power. You need to evaluate the demand, and you need to decide in an early stage, so when you won't have this capacity, you have already decided it. Very likely the people present here, we are well aware of this mentality change. They need to take decisions in time, but do you think society is aware of this need? No. No, not as a whole at all. Mr. from Jubilares, the man from Jubilares, he was raising a global perspective, and it doesn't come across a social response. and they don't have enough power to transmit this strength to the potential customer. Yeah, that's the problem. I would like to ask you too, if this vision is important, how we perceive ourselves, how society perceives us as a burden, it perceives as a business opportunity, what's our perception, what we are? Because in this vision, yes, they have the response capacity, the options, and the paths they may offer to us for us to choose. You can participate, Carlos, too. I think society doesn't perceive the elderly as a burden. We neglect the old things. Useless is a burden. There has been an intervention of someone. How little we speak about gender language for the elderly. I like that comment, because even in the elderly associations, we have a huge problem. We don't value women, who are the real protagonists, not only in Spain, but in many other countries, of the social changes, both all those who had to do with home and environment. So we were a burden, and now we have become a business opportunity, the elderly. I receive every day many companies that before, for them we didn't exist at all. They sell almost everything. Why? Because they realize in a crisis period, the young lack of money, and many unemployed people, the revenues have disappeared. The only stable income existing in society comes from the elder. So they have a pension. It's like the murder eye which turn towards the group age of the elderly. What they offer is something who has a value, such a good value. We need to stop patronizing. I oppose to be treated like a disabled person, or like a abnormal person, to be treated as a market object. I can defend myself. If I cannot defend myself, it's my fault. To be treated like a stupid person. I don't want to be a stupid person, as long as I don't become a stupid person, that I can. Is it very clear that many manufacturers, even clothes or technology manufacturers, realize there is a segment, a very important segment, which was